Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The air in the basement always felt thick, but it wasn't until recently that I realized how profoundly it weighed on my chest. The very first time I noticed it, I was at the foot of the creaking stairs looking into the gloom that stretched toward a small grim streak window in the far wall. My pulse hammered at my temples and a sudden wave of dizziness washed over me. I remember pausing there, one foot still on the bottom step, swallowed by a sense of unease so suffocating that the slightest breeze in that stale air would have made me bolt. I forced myself to go on, but the impression that something was watching me from behind the stacked boxes never really left. That was the night everything changed for me, and I've been unable to shake off this dread ever since I share this old two-story building with 3 other guys, all colleagues from work. We rent the upper floors for convenience, and the basement, damp, chilly, and half-forgotten, serves as storage. We keep tools and boxes of old books down there, mostly because we have nowhere else to put them. Nobody spends much time downstairs, and until my more recent brushes with whatever lurks in those shadows, I didn't mind heading down to organize the clutter. It gave me a moment to sort through the stuff we'd all neglected, and for a while it was almost therapeutic. The low hum of the light bulb, the faint smell of mildew paper, the sense of calm in a rarely visited space. These used to feel reassuring, but lately that comfort has morphed into a prickling sensation that crawls up my spine. The second I cross the threshold every night, I catch myself eyeing the door to the basement as I pass by it. On the way to my bedroom room, it used to be just a door-chipped paint and a rusty knob that squeaked every time I turned it. Now it looms in my peripheral vision like a malignant presence. I often notice the hair on my arm standing on end whenever I'm near it. The others claimed not to feel anything at first one day, though I mentioned hearing faint clicking noises downstairs, the sort you get when something or someone taps the wooden shelves or shifts the boxes. I expected teasing, but instead, one of them confided in a quiet tone that he thought he'd seen a shape move behind our dusty crates. He insisted it was just a trick of the light, but the uneasiness in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced by his own explanation. In the following days, my unease grew worse each time I set foot on the top stair. My breath caught in my throat, and a chill spread from my shoulders down to my fingertips. My heart would pound as if it wanted to escape my chest. And I'd wonder why I bothered going down at all, but I felt compelled to. It was as if some part of me needed to confront the tension I sensed in that cramped space. I tried to push aside the irrational fear, telling myself that it was just an old basement, damp, dark, and prone to strange echoes. One evening, I decided to spend a solid hour down there, determined to organize a few boxes of books we'd recently acquired from a friend's attic. That friend had been clearing out dusty volumes, and we volunteered to store them temporarily as soon as I opened the basement door. That stale odor rushed out, hitting my face with the distinct smell of mildew and something else, something sour and unpleasant. I ignored the urge to slam the door shut. The overhead light flickered to life, casting an anemic glow across rows of stacked crates and scattered tools. The space seemed narrower than before, as if the walls were slowly closing in my chest. Tighten, and for a moment I thought about turning around and leaving, but pride or maybe curiosity won out. So I gripped the railing, took a deep breath, and descended. My first steps echoed on the old wooden stairs. The tension in the air felt almost tangible, like walking through fog. Each breath tasted stale. When I reached the bottom, I ran a hand along the rough concrete wall, feeling tiny cracks beneath my fingertips. My heart rised at the slightest creak or groan in the wood beams. Still, I forced myself to move deeper, heading toward the clusters of boxes piled near the far wall, where that small grimy window LED in a sliver of twilight. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. A weight pressed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My palms grew clammy, and I wiped them on my pants, trying to ground myself in the mundane act of reorganizing. As I began shifting boxes, I became acutely aware of every rustle and scrape. The paperbacks and hardcover books inside seemed heavier than they should be, and when I moved one particular box, a dull thump resonated as if something within shifted on its own. My heart jolted. I placed the box down carefully, feeling my throat constrict. Nothing spilled out, but I still hesitated to open it. A faint scraping sound came from behind me. I whirled around, nearly dropping the flashlight I had in my other hand. There was no one there, only rows of shelves stocked with tools, jars of nails, and a few ragged tarps. The flickering light bulb overhead cast jittery shadows that danced across the walls. I told myself it must have been the sound of a settling floorboard. I tried to dismiss the goosebumps on my arms, the dryness in my mouth, and the tug at the back of my mind that insisted I wasn't alone. After some time, I realized I was only pretending to look through books. I wasn't actually reading titles or taking inventory. I was just stalling, glancing up at every imagined movement. When I finally decided to collect myself and leave, I felt a sudden burst of cold air brush past my neck. It was so distinct that I gasped. Dropping one of the books, it landed on the concrete floor with a hollow slap, and I swear the sound echoed longer than it should have. My heart was in my throat. I clenched my fist, trying to suppress the panic. Even though every instinct screamed at me to hurry upstairs, I forced myself to stay a bit longer. I picked up the fallen book and noticed my hands were trembling so badly that I nearly fumbled it again. I left shortly after, my nerves too. Afraid to continue, once I was back in my room, the relief was almost overwhelming. I felt as though I had escaped from something intangible yet potent. I spent the rest of the night replaying the scene in my head, wondering what logical explanation I could cling to. Cold drafts, echoing footsteps, my own paranoia, but a knowing suspicion remained. Something else was going on down there, something that couldn't be brushed off by rational excuses over the next week. I tried talking to my roommates again. I spoke indirectly about the tension and the sounds, and the one who had previously thought he saw movement behind the boxes now admitted he refused to go down alone. Another roommate hinted that he'd felt nauseous once or twice. After descending just a few steps, a third said there was probably mold, and that could explain the air quality and dizziness. That last theory didn't quite account for the unsettling shapes at the edge of vision, though, or the sudden blasts of cold. Yet none of them wanted to push the subject any further. They seemed relieved to leave the basement alone. I felt isolated in my curiosity, like I was the only one who had the burden of figuring out what really lurked in those shadows. In the days that followed, the sense of foreboding grew more intense. Merely passing by the closed basement door was enough to make my pulse spike. I found myself eyeing the floor beneath my feet, as if expecting to see black tendrils creeping up through the cracks. My dreams became restless. I would wake in a cold sweat, certain that I had heard footsteps coming from below. Sometimes I imagined faint whispers bleeding through the floorboards, the words incomprehensible yet loaded with a sinister edge. The more I tried to dismiss these nightmares, the more palpable they became, lingering in my thoughts, even in broad daylight. At one point, I decided enough was enough. My fear was growing into an obsession. I reasoned that if I confronted it head-on, maybe I could regain my peace of mind. Late one night, while the house was silent, I armed myself with a strong flashlight, pulled on a heavy jacket, and made my way downstairs. The door hinge squeaked in the stillness. My heart thundered against my ribs, but I forced myself onward. Each step down felt like a step into a different realm, the darkness becoming thicker, the air turning stale and sour. When I reached the bottom, I paused, shining the flashlight around slowly. The beam revealed the same row of shelves, the same stacks of boxes, but tonight they looked twisted, as if the shapes had shifted in the darkness, forming unfamiliar silhouettes. My breath came in ragged gasps, and a fine layer of sweat coated my forehead. I took a few more steps toward the far end of the basement, where the narrow window fell in just enough light to create murky patches on the floor. The tension in the air was unbearable, as if the entire place was holding its breath. Waiting for me to make a wrong move, I approached one stack of boxes that had always seemed suspicious to me. The place where my colleague once said he thought he'd seen something move. As I moved closer, I noticed a strange scratching sound so faint I almost doubted it was real. It reminded me of nails scraping against cardboard, or the rustle of something alive trapped inside a box. I froze, shining the flashlight on the exact spot the noise seemed to come from. There was nothing but old crates and a few tarps folded in a corner, yet the sound persisted intermittently. My legs felt weak and my mouth went so dry that I could hardly swallow. As I stood there, torn between running upstairs and investigating further, the overhead light flickered violently, plunging the basement into near complete darkness for a heartbeat before sputtering back in. That split second, I caught sight of a vague outline lurking behind the largest box. My entire body tensed as if an electric current had passed through me. I whipped the flashlight around, but the shape was gone. The only thing visible was the damp concrete wall broken by the heavy shadows of stacked crates. The scraping intensified. It now sounded like something, shifting the boxes from behind as if trying to make room or trying to push its way out. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. My breathing was fast, shallow, every exhalation coming with a slight tremor. I took a step back, nearly stumbling over a tool left on the floor. The light flickered again. In that moment, I felt certain there was a presence looming right behind me. A wave of cold rolled across my neck and I spun around, flashlight, raised half expecting to see a face leering at me. There was nothing but stale air and disorganized clutter. Suddenly, a metallic clang echoed from the shelves as though a hammer or wrench had been knocked to the floor. I aimed the beam of light toward the sound, feeling the tightness in my chest grow. The shelves were trembling, or so it seemed in the unstable illumination. My vision blurred slightly, and I had to blink several times to refocus. The feeling of being watched bore down on me from every corner. I wanted to call out to demand that whatever was down here reveal itself, but my voice refused to cooperate at that point. My flight response took over. My hands trembled as I shoved the flashlight into my jacket pocket. I turned on my heel and dashed toward the stairs. My shoulder brushed against a shelf, nearly sending a few tools clattering to the floor, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting back to the relative safety of the corridor above. I felt something, an icy, intangible force, graze the back of my neck as I sprinted. A strangled gasp escaped my throat. I practically threw myself against the banister, bounding up the steps 2 at a time. The light bulb buzzed and flickered behind me, casting frantic shadows on the walls. The door at the top was still open, and in a blur of desperation, I hurled myself through it and slammed it shut for a moment. I just stood there in the hallway, gasping for air, feeling a sheen of cold sweat on my skin. My heart drummed so fiercely that I half expected it to burst from my chest. Every muscle in my body was taut, and my mind whirled with confusion and lingering terror. Yet strangely, once I was out of that basement, the silence of the house felt alien, almost serene. It was as if the atmosphere upstairs couldn't hold on to the same crawling dread that existed below. I locked the basement door. My hand shook so badly that it took 2 tries to align the key in the following days. I told my roommates that something was seriously wrong down there. I hinted that we should move out or call someone, an inspector, an exorcist. I wasn't even sure they listened quietly, acting the dread, but clearly hoping we could just avoid the basement altogether. In hushed tones, they mentioned that the door unnerved them too, that they sometimes heard faint tapping sounds from underneath, but no one wanted to dwell on it. We ended up leaving the door locked, deciding collectively to forego the basement altogether unless absolutely necessary. Now every time I walk past that door, my pulse quickens and I remember the sensation of that cold-watching PR press. Sometimes I swear I hear faint scratching sounds, even when I'm on the 2nd floor, as if the walls themselves carry the echoes of something restless. Late at night, my dreams remain haunted by flickering lights, half-seen shapes lurking behind stacks of crates, and a subtle urgent need to run before something unseen catches me off guard. I can't bring myself to move out yet. I'm not sure it would help. The feeling might follow me wherever I go, etched into my psyche like a scar. I haven't descended those stairs. Again, part of me wants to prove that my imagination has gotten the better of me, that all of it can be rationalized. But some deeper instinct warns me that I brushed against something no amount of reason can fully explain. It's a presence that seems dormant now, but I can't be certain it won't stir again. The fear still coats my nights in a thin film of paranoia, and even bright daylight can't cleanse the memory of that oppressive darkness I live in. Uneasy coexistence with that basement door. I never open it, but I feel it as I pass by, an invisible weight pressing against my chest and reminding me of all that I experienced. Sometimes I catch myself pausing in front of it, heart-pounding, hand trembling on the handle. But I don't turn the knob. I know that if I ventured down there again, I might find that the boxes have shifted, the tools have been rearranged, or that the shadows are waiting, buying their time for another encounter, and I know I wouldn't be prepared for what I'd see or what would see me. The worst part is the lingering question: did I truly witness something impossible, or did I simply lose my grip on reality for a few harrowing minutes in the dark, musty room? Either possibility chills me for now. I choose not to seek the answer. The tension behind that locked door is enough of a reminder that some secrets are best left buried in the MC of an old basement. Never fully understood, but always felt and always feared felt it. From the very first moment I slid the key into the lock, a low thrum in the air like an invisible current humming behind the sleek walls and polished floors. It was subtle, easy to ignore if I tried, but it clung to me like static. This was supposed to be a dream come true, a modern loft in a newly renovated building located in a prestigious neighborhood with an enviable view of the city. Skyline, the rent was suspiciously low, but I convinced myself it was a stroke of luck. I was wrong. That subtle vibration in the air turned out to be a warning during my initial walk. There I tried to appreciate the contemporary design: high ceilings, exposed concrete beams, floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched across the main living space. It all felt sophisticated and stylish, as if I were living inside a home decor magazine. The building's corridor smelled of fresh paint and newly laid carpet. The faint odor of industrial cleaning products hung around the lobby, and I thought it was a sign that everything was brand new and well-maintained. A friendly but distant building manager mentioned that I was among the first tenants to move in. After an extensive renovation project, I took that as a good omen. For the first few days, I felt surprisingly comfortable. My furniture fit perfectly in the open floor plan. The sunlight poured through those massive windows every morning, illuminating the quartz countertops and the impeccable metal finishes in the kitchen. During the evenings, I would sit on the plush sofa and soak in the view of the city lights, telling myself this was exactly the urban life I had long envisioned, yet there was something in the quiet that unnerved me. The building itself was too silent. I rarely heard noise from neighbors, not even the usual muffled sounds of footsteps in the hallway or televisions behind closed doors. More than once I caught myself checking the peal, uncertain if I'd actually heard something scuttle by in the corridor or if it was just my imagination. My heart would skip a beat every time I peered into that fisheye lens, but I never spotted anyone. It was on the fifth night that I started noticing the changes. At first, the shift was so slight I almost dismissed it. The coffee table seemed a fraction of an inch off from its original position. I chalked it up to memory lapses. Perhaps I bumped into it while cleaning or moved it absent-mindedly, but my unease lingered, intensifying whenever I found a cabinet door cracked open in the morning, even though I had made sure to close everything the night before. Over the following days, those small discrepancies piled up. A lamp on the side table was turned slightly away from the sofa. The bar stools at the kitchen island weren't aligned in their neat row one morning. The silverware drawer was half open, all the utensils jumbled in disarray, despite my meticulous habit of keeping them organized. Each time I noticed something, my pulse quickened. I tried telling myself I was simply overwhelmed from work or that I was more absent-minded than I cared to admit, but every explanation I gave myself felt paper thin. I decided I needed proof. I placed small pieces of tape on the floor around the legs of the chairs and the coffee table. It was a crude method, but it would at least confirm if the furniture was indeed moving when I wasn't around. I also checked the locks before leaving each morning, making a note in my phone of exactly how many times I turned the key and how firmly I pushed the door to ensure it was shut tight. I even tucked a strip of paper between the door and the frame as a subtle indicator. One evening, I returned from work drained by a long day of meetings. I walked into the loft and felt a cold wave pass over me, as though the temperature had dropped the moment I crossed the threshold. My arms prickled with goosebumps despite the moderate indoor climate. I turned on the lights and immediately glanced at the living room furniture. 2 chairs were definitely shifted outside the perimeter I had marked. My heart began to hammer even more. Unsettling, the thin sliding door that opened to the veranda was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it that morning. I distinctly remembered hearing the click of the latch, yet now it stood open a crack, letting in the faint noise of distant traffic. I rushed to check the door, thinking perhaps I had left it loose or the renovation was subpar. Maybe the door seal was faulty, but as I slid it shut, I had the unmistakable sensation that someone had been on the other side, only moments before my breath caught in my throat and I froze, waiting to see if I could detect any sound, footsteps, a shuffle of fabric, anything at all, when nothing came. I tried to steady my breathing, feeling my chest tighten. My palms were clammy and my ears filled with the blood pounding in my head. Each night that followed brought new reasons for alarm. One evening I came home to find the lights on in the bathroom. I never leave lights on when I go out. Another time the door to my bedroom was closed, though I always keep it open for better airflow. I tried to speak casually with the building manager about the odd occurrences, asking if there had been any reports of break-ins or if the security cameras might be malfunctioning. He only replied that the building was designed with the top-of-the-line security systems. He might have said something like, "We've had no issues so far," but it was delivered in a polite, almost rehearsed tone. He did not appear concerned, and I left the conversation feeling no closer to an answer. Sleep became a battleground. I would snap awake at the faintest sound, a creak from the pipes, a slight rattle of the window. Sometimes I could swear I heard soft footsteps pacing. The loft each time I would bolt out of bed, heart hammering to find nothing. My body's fight ORF flight response was so heightened that even the hum of the refrigerator could set me on edge. I stayed up late with the lights on, scanning each corner of the loft for anything out of place. Then in the mornings, I'd stumble to work. Exhausted, half convinced that I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. At one point, I considered installing my own security camera, but something about that idea felt intrusive, even though it was my own place. It was as if a part of me feared capturing footage of something I couldn't rationalize. Instead, I tried to gather more subtle evidence. I placed pieces of paper across the door frames at night, taped delicately so they would fall if disturbed. Sometimes I would place a set of keys on the edge of the coffee table in a certain position and check it meticulously in the morning. Every single morning I would find at least one sign that something or someone had been moving around in my home while I slept. The more it continued, the more I felt my confidence erode. My perception of reality began to warp, as if the loft itself was rebelling against my presence. I became paranoid outside the building at work or even in the grocery store. My mind would constantly wonder what was happening in the loft when I wasn't there. If a colleague asked if I was feeling all right, I would just brush it off, saying I hadn't been sleeping well, but my clammy hands and the dark circles under my eyes were becoming more and more obvious. I even caught a glimpse of my reflection in an elevator door one day. My usually calm demeanor looked ragged. My gaze frantic one night while lying awake in bed, I heard a distinct dragging sound from the living room. My stomach clenched and a spike of adrenaline rushed through my veins. I sat up, my heart pounding so loudly it almost masked the noise. The dragging stopped for a moment, then resumed with a squeak, as if a heavy piece of furniture was being moved. I crept out of bed, the wooden floor sea beneath my feet, and inched toward the living room with my phone's flashlight shaking in my hand when I flipped on the main light. Everything appeared normal except for one of the dining chairs, which was now angled toward the hallway, facing me like a silent sentinel. My chest felt hollow, and I bit down on my lower lip to stifle a gasp. I could feel my heart thundering to the point of pain. After that, I couldn't stay passive anymore. The manager's indifference made me furious, so the next morning I confronted him more directly. I explained the situation in detail, mentioning that I had proof of the furniture shifting. He responded that maybe the floors were uneven or that vibrations from nearby construction could be affecting the loft. His tone was calm, bordering on patronizing. I left the conversation feeling an eerie sense that my concerns were being systematically brushed aside, like a quirk of the building that no one wanted to address. It was worse than no response. It was as though he knew something but refused to admit it. One evening, I began to examine every inch of the loft, searching for clues. Loose floor panels, hidden compartments, or any sign of forced entry. I tapped walls, opened every cupboard, and inspected the ceiling vents. Nothing seemed amiss. Then, as I was sliding my hand along the baseboard near the living room, I felt the faintest draft. The air was cold in that spot, carrying an odor that was both metallic and vaguely damp. I pressed my palm firmly against the wall until I located a subtle indentation. My nerves were on edge, every muscle tense with expectation, when I pushed a small section of the wall gave way. An access panel cleverly hidden behind the fresh paint. Behind it lay a narrow crawl space. I could see only darkness at first, and the air that seeped out was stale, sending a chill through my entire body. My breathing became shallow, and beads of sweat trickled along my temples, summoning courage. I shone a flashlight inside the beam, revealed nothing more than a tight passage that seemed to run along the perimeter of the loft. But what struck me was the scuff marks on the dusty floor of the crawl space, as if someone or something had been moving through there. I felt my throat tighten, my vision blurred momentarily from the rush of fear. My immediate impulse was to slam the panel shut, but curiosity battled with dread. I reached in with trembling hands, heart pounding so hard it reverberated in my ears. The passage was cramped. I could only crawl if I dared to go inside. A wave of claustrophobia swept over me. I didn't know what I expected to find, but the knowledge that there was a hidden route running adjacent to my walls made my skin crawl that night. Sleep was impossible. I sat on my sofa, lights on, phone in hand, debating whether to call someone, maybe a friend or a locksmith or even the police. But what would I say that my furniture was moving on its own? And I found a hidden passage with footprints. It sounded absurd, like the beginning of a cheap horror movie. At around 3 in the morning, I dozed off unintentionally when I jolted awake. An hour or two later, my phone was on the floor and the lights were off. I remembered clearly that I had left every lamp blazing. My mouth went dry and I stood up shakily to turn the nearest switch back on. It was excruciatingly silent. Too silent the following day, I arranged to leave work earlier than usual. A gnawing sense of urgency told me I had to see the crawl space in daylight when I got home. The living room furniture was askew again. This time, one chair was overturned completely. My pulse pounded as I yanked open the hidden panel in the wall. A breeze of cold, stale air rushed out, carrying an almost electrical tang. In the daylight, I could see a small light fixture inside, wired to an outlet that looked ancient. I flicked it on and it buzzed into a weak, flickering glow. Then, with trembling limbs, I crawled inside. The fear of what I might find threatened to paralyze me, but I pressed forward. The space was cramped, forcing me to crawl over debris and dust-caked floorboards. After a few feet, I noticed faint footprints in the dust, barefoot prints that seemed fresh. My scalp tingled with dread, and I began to question everything. Was this an intruder sneaking in at night? But how and why? The corridor turned sharply, leading deeper into darkness. My breathing grew labored and sweat slicked my palms. Eventually, I reached a dead end that opened into a small chamber with an old metal chair. A single piece of paper lay on the seat, folded neatly. My heart thundered as I picked it up. All it said in shaky handwriting was a brief note describing how the building does not belong to us. There was no signature, no date. It made no sense. A sudden metallic clang echoed from somewhere behind me, as though the wall had closed. My entire body went rigid, a surge of pure adrenaline launching me into panic. I scrambled back toward the entrance, banging my shins and elbows against the tight walls. By the time I reached the panel, my breath was coming in ragged gasps, my t-shirt drenched in sweat. I half expected the panel to be sealed shut, trapping me inside, but it slid open with a creak, revealing my loft when I emerged. I couldn't stop shaking my mind, spun with questions. Who made that noise? Was it just the building settling, or was something else in there? With me, I slammed the panel shut, dragged the heaviest bookcase I owned across the living room, and wedged it against the wall to block the access point. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and my vision danced with dark spots from hyperventilation. I tried to calm myself, inhaling deeply through my nose, counting to 10 before exhaling it. Barely helped. My entire body felt like a live wire overcharged with terror. My thoughts raced. Was this place haunted, or was it a twisted design left behind by previous owners? The manager's dismissive attitude suggested he knew something but was unwilling to share it. Something inside me snapped that evening. My fear morphed into a desperate resolve. I could no longer live like this, second-guessing my sanity. Every moment I stuffed my essentials into a backpack, grabbed my keys, and left the loft behind while stepping into the elevator. My heart felt like it might burst from my chest. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I would see a shadow in the hallway or hear the scraping of furniture from behind the door, but the corridor was silent as always. That silence felt heavier now, as if the entire building pulsed with a quiet malevolence. When I reached the lobby, I approached the manager one last time. I asked if I could terminate my lease early, citing personal reasons. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and something else, relief perhaps. Without any fuss, he simply nodded and told me the necessary paperwork could be arranged. Within days, that was all. No questions, no attempts to convince me otherwise. I left the building and didn't look back until I was across the street for a long moment. I stood there, breath coming fast and shallow. The exterior looked so pristine, glass, steel, and clean lines. But now every window felt like a dark eye following me. My mind replayed the footsteps in my loft, the chairs moving on their own, and the warrant of hidden passageway ways behind those modern walls. I realized I would never truly understand what was wrong with that place, and a part of me didn't want to. I just wanted to be a way to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, even after settling into a new location. I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear that faint dragging sound. My hands clam up with sweat and my heartbeat echoes in my ears. There are moments when I find myself staring at furniture, half expecting to see it shift on its own. Sometimes I think back to that cryptic note in the hidden chamber, the one that suggested the building had a consciousness of its own or was under some control. Beyond comprehension, even though I escaped physically, a piece of my mind remains stuck in that loft. Replaying the terror no matter where I am, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Everyday noises now seem menacing, a squeak in the floor, the hum of an air conditioner, a faint gust of wind against a window. There's always a part of me that wonders if something followed me out of that place, something that likes to rearrange objects and slip through unseen corridors late at night. When my new apartment is silent, I lie awake, heart pounding, ears straining for the slightest sound of movement. If I do hear anything, I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down I know better. I'm still waiting for that next flicker of movement or that unexplained echo, and even though I've left that twisted loft behind, I fear I'll never truly be free of it. The memory of being under its watchful influence clings to me, a silent reminder that some places and the secrets they harbor are not so easily left behind. Even now, I cannot say with certainty whether the building was haunted, inhabited by a hidden intruder, or caught in some distorted reality. All I know is that once you've witnessed furniture shift by itself and experienced the sensation of cold eyes, observing your every move, you learn that fear is not always something that can be locked away behind a door. Sometimes it finds a passage through the walls, creeping closer with every breath you take. I arrived at the old countryside house on a chill afternoon. From the moment I set foot on the property, the air felt heavy, as though something unseen pressed down on my shoulders. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and every sound echoed in the surrounding silence. I knew I came here looking for peace and escape from the relentless noise of the city. But the hushed stillness of the place made me uneasy. The thick canopy of trees seemed to whisper, secrets among themselves, rustling and brushing against each other in a language I could almost understand but couldn't quite decipher. Even before I went inside, I sensed that something about this place was off, like its very foundation harbored a long-kept secret that wanted to be heard. I had accepted my colleague's offer to stay at his remote countryside retreat. Without hesitation, he told me it was a well-preserved, older construction nestled in a swath of untouched native forest. The walls looked sturdy enough, and every beam in the ceiling was polished smooth. but there was an unmistakable sense of age embedded in the structure. The front door made a low groan when I pushed it open, and I could smell the must of old wood. Faint traces of Polish and something else I couldn't name, a stale odor that reminded me of damp earth. After a rainstorm on my first evening, I turned on the lights inside and walked through each room. The living area was modest, featuring a worn sofa and a rug with intricate faded patterns. An antique grandfather clock stood in the corner, and a ticking offered the only persistent sound in the house. There was a small kitchen in the back with outdated appliances, but they seemed functional enough. The bedroom faced the dense woodland, and I could see swaying branches through the window. At dusk, the trees took on a strange, distorted shape as the dying light stretched their shadows across the yard, trying to relax. I prepared a simple dinner. I wanted to quiet my mind, so I ate slowly and watched the forest through the kitchen window. Everything outside darkened rapidly, as though night had an unusual eagerness. Here the moon was obscured by thick clouds, and the property was swallowed in darkness. Only the occasional flicker of the porch light offered any illumination. I felt a subtle tug of anxiety in my chest. Nothing overpowering, just an apprehension that made my hand tremble slightly as I held my fork. After finishing my meal, I tried to shake off the unease, repeating to myself that I was here to unwind. That first night, I laid down on the creaking bed and listened to the night sounds. Crickets chirped in an almost mechanical rhythm, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves. I drifted off quicker than I expected, probably worn out from the drive. Then, not long past midnight, I jerked awake. My heart hammered in my chest, and my skin felt cold and clammy. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what had startled me, but as I strained my ears, I caught it. Faint, rhythmic clicking sounds like knuckles on wood. Perhaps under the floorboards, the noise came in short intervals, a steady pattern that stopped for a few seconds before resuming. I bolted upright, my breath shallow, and peered at the wooden floor. The room was too dark to see anything. The sound kept going measured and insistent. I tried to rationalize it by thinking of raccoons or some other woodland creature scurrying beneath the house. My colleague had mentioned small animals wandering around at night, so I forced myself to accept a mundane explanation. Still, my throat felt tight, and each click sent a jolt through my nerves. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, the sounds dissipated, and I managed to fall back into a restless sleep. The next day, the sun was out, and everything looked normal again. I almost laughed at how uneasy I had felt the night before. I spent the morning strolling around the property, checking out the tall grass near the tree line and admiring the vibrant flowers that had popped up near the fence. Although I didn't find any animal tracks under the house, I assumed they could be too faint or hidden by the foundation. By mid-afternoon, I was feeling more at ease, so I lounged in a makeshift hammock and tried to read occasionally. Gazing at the patches of sky through the swaying branches, KN descended once again, this time more quietly than before. The moon emerged, giving the yard a strange silver glow. I double-checked all the locks, both on the windows and doors, then settled into bed. My eyelids were heavy, but something still nagged me, an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't entirely shrug off around midnight. A quick series of soft taps on the window made me freeze. They were almost delicate, like fingertips tapping on glass, and my heart began to race uncontrollably. I forced myself out of bed, expecting to see a stray branch hitting the pane when I looked outside. Nothing was there, only the dense blackness of the trees, even though I saw no one. My pulse wouldn't slow down, the nails on my arms pricked with goosebumps, and a sheen of sweat coated my forehead. At that moment, I remembered my colleague mentioning a caretaker who lived in a nearby cabin, but he had also said the caretaker wouldn't come around unless I needed something. I wondered if perhaps this person was playing a trick or checking on the property. I flicked on the porch light and stepped outside, the cool air biting at my cheeks. I couldn't see any footprints or signs of someone lurking around the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of damp leaves in the forest. Beyond seemed eerily quiet. I thought I heard a soft whistle in the distance, but when I held my breath to listen more carefully, it faded. The next morning, I decided to take a quick walk around the perimeter of the property. Searching for anything out of place, the thick forest floor was covered in a layer of fallen leaves, and every step produced a dull crunch. Nothing indicated that someone had been sneaking around at night. I told myself I was overreacting, maybe letting the isolation play tricks on me. Still, the memory of those tapping sounds sent a chill up my spine. Whenever I replayed them in my mind on the third night, fatigue was weighing me down. But anxiety electrified my senses. I tried to convince myself that I was simply projecting my fears onto random nighttime noises. Hours passed uneventfully until that clicking returned louder this time with an agitated rhythm. The tempo rose and fell like a coded message trying to get my attention. Every muscle in my body tensed. My hands trembled and a dry tightness seized my throat. Then out of nowhere, those same gentle taps on the window, this time from multiple sides of the house. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and my legs felt rigid, as though they might lock if I tried to move. Summoning some courage, I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness in erratic arcs, illuminating patches of grass and the lower trunks of ancient trees. I caught sight of my own breath hanging in the air. Then I heard it, a low whistle, no longer distant but closer. Winding through the trees, it reverberated in my chest, each note making my heart pound. I scanned the edge of the forest but saw only the shifting shadows cast by the moonlight. In an attempt to regain my composure, I climbed onto the porch and tried calling out, but the night swallowed my words. I considered calling my colleague or even the caretaker, but it felt too late for that. And I had no solid reason to accuse anyone of messing around instead. I locked myself back in and stayed awake by the flickering light of a single lamp until dawn finally broke. My nerves were frayed by the next morning. The tension manifested physically. My hands trembled when I tried to pour coffee. My breath hitched whenever a floorboard creaked, and my stomach churned with lingering dread. I phoned my colleague to see if he'd ever experienced anything odd out here. He calmly assured me that he never had, though he heard rumors about local legends. Nothing too serious, just stories of unsettled spirits wandering the woods, the kind of folklore people share over campfires. I didn't laugh, my throat was too dry for that. By the fourth night, a thick fog rolled in, adding another layer of claustrophobia to the property. The whiteness covered the trees, giving them a ghostly silhouette under the moonlight. When I shut off the lights to try and sleep, the house felt suffocating, as though something pressed in on all sides. My heart thumped in my ears, a steady drum that matched my shaky breathing. I woke with a start around 1 a.m, disoriented and clammy. My ears strained for any unusual sound. The wood groaned beneath me, and then the tapping began again. Only this time it traveled like footsteps scraping against the boards. It moved from one corner of the house to another, slow and deliberate. I could imagine something crawling or dragging itself across the floor. Dread coiled in my stomach. Then the taps on the window resumed, as if slender fingers were drumming impatiently. I pressed my palms to my ears and tried to shut it out. My own pulse roared in my head, but I couldn't block the sound. After several minutes of this auditory torment, I decided I had to see it for myself. I clenched my jaw, mustered a surge of determination, and switched on the lamp. My vision was hazy from adrenaline, but I forced my shaking legs to carry me to the window through the glass. All I saw was darkness, then a whisper of movement near the tree line. Just enough to trigger every alarm in my body. I tried to focus on the shape, but it melded into the shadows. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. Maybe I was losing it. Seeing illusions conjured by my fear, my chest felt constricted and I was drenched in sweat, though the night was cold. The next day I did my best to hold on to a shred of rationality. I scoured the underbelly of the house again, finding no holes or tunnels that an animal could use to get under there and create such noises. The caretaker stopped by briefly to check on some loose fencing through indirect conversation. I tried to convey my unease. He seemed puzzled, explaining in careful words that the area had a history of odd sightings, but mostly dismissed them as superstitious. Even so, he advised I remain cautious at night and keep a fire going if possible, which he said might deter unwanted guests, human or otherwise. After he left, the stillness of the property felt heavier, like an oppressive cloak on the fifth night. Everything escalated. The air had an electric quality and the forest was eerily silent. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, only a tense hush. I couldn't relax, my heartbeat was already pounding before anything even happened. Suddenly, the tapping on the window came again, sharp and purposeful, followed by that same insistent clicking from beneath the floor. A cold sweat covered my body. I felt the walls close in on me and my breathing turned frantic. My mouth went bone dry and I had to swallow, repeatedly just to keep from choking on my own fear. That's when the light started flickering. The lamp in the living room blinked rapidly and the overhead bulb in the hallway sputtered like it was about to die. Each flash cast jagged shadows across the walls, creating fleeting shapes that seemed to leap toward me. My paranoia peaked, and for a moment I was sure I saw a silhouette at the window, tall, impossibly thin. Staring in a wave of nausea hit me. I stumbled backward, knocking into a small table. I heard the crash of an old vase shattering, but my eyes stayed fixated on that spot by the glass. Then the light steadied and the silhouette was gone. By this point, every cell in my body screamed that I had to leave. I rushed to gather my belongings, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. The floor creaked with a frenzy of clicking beneath my feet, as though something was chasing after me through the walls. The windows rattled and the whistling wind outside turned into a howl that made the glass vibrate. My throat constricted and the cold air stung my lungs. Then in one horrifying moment, every bit of noise ceased. No wind, no tapping, no creaking floorboards. It was as if the house held its breath. Waiting in that instant, I was sure something was right behind me. The hair on my arm stood up and a paralyzing chill traveled the length of my spine. A clawing sense of dread consumed me. My mind screamed to turn around, but my body was frozen in place, chest heaving. Heart hammering, the silence was worse than the noises. It was absolute, and it made me question whether my next breath would be allowed. My vision blurred and I felt a surge of lightheadedness as if I might pass out. Then all at once, the tension shattered. The whistling outside roared back to life and the floor reverberated with another burst of clicks. The windows vibrated under a rapid series of taps. That jolt was enough to get me moving again. I found my car keys and barreled through the front door. Outside, the fog had descended once more, thick as a wall. I could barely see the porch steps. My skin prickled, certain I was being watched from the dense tree line. My pulse thundered in my ears and every breath came in short, ragged gasps. I fumbled my way to the car, tossing my duffel bag into the passenger seat as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated a chaotic dance of swirling fog. I swear I saw shapes moving within it, drifting back and forth between the trees, but I didn't dare linger to look. My mind was on the brink, teetering between reality and terror. Induced delusion the tires spun on. The damp gravel, and I sped off down the winding country road. In the rearview mirror, the looming silhouette of that old house faded into the mist. When I finally reached a paved road, my heartbeat was still unsteady and my body felt like it had been through some battle. My skin prickled with residual fear, and I caught myself checking the backseat, convinced something might have followed me even hours later when I stopped at a roadside diner for coffee. My hands wouldn't stop shaking every time the door chime rang. I jumped, expecting to see that shape from the window behind me. To this day, I'm not entirely sure what happened out there. Part of me wants to believe I was simply overwhelmed by the isolation, that the relentless silence and the creaks of an old house warped my perception. But at night, when I close my eyes, I still hear those rhythmic clicks resonating in my memory. I still feel the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. Sometimes in the corner of my vision, I catch a fleeting glimpse of a tall, thin figure stepping behind a wall or slipping into a doorway. It's gone in a blink, but the memory of that oppressive presence remains. My colleague has asked if I might ever return to his countryside place for another getaway. I gave a non-committal response, but my mind reeled with unease. I can't imagine stepping foot on that porch again. The mere thought of that tapping on the window and that eerie whistle echoing through the trees is enough to make my heart slam against my ribs, whether it was something supernatural or a trick of my own psyche. I can't discard the feeling that I encountered something there, something that was curious or hungry or simply eager to be noticed. And though I escaped physically unscathed, I can't shake the lingering sense that I brought a fragment of that place back with me, lodged deep within my own fear. Even here, surrounded by people and the steady hum of city life, there are moments in the dark when I feel the faintest brush of a presence I can't quite name. And I wonder if those tapping sounds might someday find me again, just to remind me that some doors once open can never truly be closed. I stepped into the dimly lit corridor with a sinking feeling in my stomach. The walls seemed to press in around me, their peeling paint revealing layers of the building's history in jagged strips. An oppressive silence seeped through the cracked plaster, only broken by the electric hum of the old overhead light. I could feel the weight of the night bearing down on me as if the very air were thick with unspoken secrets. The door to my tiny apartment was just a few steps away, but each footfall felt like a step into deeper darkness, a darkness that tugged at the edges of my sanity. Even before I turned the key, I sensed I was no longer alone in this place, though logic insisted I was the only one there. I've lived in this cramped unit for several months now. It's perched in the heart of the city's historical district, a location both charming and unsettling. The centuries-old facade might delight a casual tourist, but inside the building feels like a labyrinth of narrow hallways that twist and turn at absurd angles. When I first moved in, I tried to see it as an adventure: antique floors, vintage fixtures, a sense of living inside history. Yet the charm wore off quickly. The corridors are dimly lit by flickering bulbs, the walls forever shedding plaster dust, and the claustrophobic layout always sets my nerves on edge. An older neighbor once mentioned through hushed words in the lobby that this building had undergone countless renovations over the decades. Each time the contractors found structural oddities that never fully made sense: old doorways sealed off behind brand new drywall, odd crawl spaces that led nowhere. I didn't think much of it then, but now that detail hangs in the back of my mind like a warning. Lately, little things have been gnawing at my nerves, especially the sweet, heavy floral perfume that greets me whenever I step into the elevator after work. Initially, I assumed someone must be wearing it, or perhaps a neighbor had sprayed air freshener, but day after day I find the elevator empty, the corners dark, the corners silent, and that clawing fragrance saturates the air as though something intangible lingers there. At first I shrugged it off. City living comes with eccentric neighbors, and an old building can hold on to smells in strange ways, but that perfume is pungent. In a way that defies explanation, it's almost sickly sweet, reminiscent of overripe flowers about to decay. The more I smell it, the more intense it becomes. Clinging to my hair, to my clothes, I notice it especially on rainy days, as if moisture in the air unlocks the scent embedded in the building's walls. Whenever I leave the elevator, I can't help but check the corners, anticipating the silhouette of some stranger who must have just stepped off on another floor. Yet no one is ever there. Not once. Even more disturbing are the voices I hear at night. They started quietly, low murmurs just outside my door, as if 2 or 3 people were whispering conspiratorially. I remember the first time it happened, I snapped awake, heart pounding my forehead, damp with sweat. A muffled conversation drifted through the crack at the bottom of the door. I lay there holding my breath, trying to discern words. They were too soft, too indistinct when I finally gathered the courage to fling the door open. I was greeted by an empty corridor glowing under the dull yellow light. No one turned a corner, no door clicked shut. It was as if the conversation had dissolved into the stale air. I told myself it was just my imagination, a half-sleep delusion. But the whispers returned the following night and the next. Sometimes I'd catch them around 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes just after midnight. Always too quiet to understand, always gone. The moment I stepped outside, the first few times I actually knocked on neighboring doors the next day to ask if anyone had been out in the hall. Each neighbor claimed ignorance, insisting they hadn't heard or seen anything unusual. A few shrugged apologetically, while others offered me polite smiles that seemed laced with mild concern for my state of mind. I started to feel foolish pressing the issue and stopped asking altogether. Letting my unease simmer, My anxiety only grew worse that perfume continued to appear unannounced, even more unsettling on nights when the voices were at their loudest. The floral scent would creep under my door almost as if carried by a light draft. My throat would tighten the pungent odor, and I'd feel my pulse hammering in my ears in those moments. The line between imagination and reality blurred. The air in my apartment turned suffocatingly stale, and I'd be compelled to open a window, gulping at the city's polluted breeze just to clear my head one night. While returning from work under pouring rain, I was assaulted by an overwhelming wave of that perfume. The instant I stepped into the elevator, my eyes watered from the potency. My hands trembled on the ancient metal handrail, and I found myself holding my breath just to avoid inhaling. That sickly aroma the ride up felt agonizingly slow, as if something wanted me to remain there, trapped with the scent of decomposing flowers pressing against my senses. By the time the elevator door rattled open on my floor, my heart was in my throat and I was practically sprinting to my apartment door. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The hallway was empty, but my skin prickled as though unseen eyes followed my every movement. My key slipped in my sweaty palm, and it took me several tries before I managed to unlock the door. Inside, I locked up and quickly flicked on the lights, scanning every corner like a paranoid intruder. Of course, I found nothing amiss, but I couldn't stop my pulse from racing. My lungs felt tight, and a layer of cold perspiration clung to my forehead. Over the following days, the sense of being observed never left me even at work. My concentration faltered. I'd catch myself glancing at the corners of the office, expecting a flicker of movement that never appeared. My coworkers noticed I was on edge. One of them asked if I was sleeping. Okay, I mumbled some excuse about stress and deadlines, not daring to mention the bizarre episodes in my building. I was convinced they'd laugh, or worse, take pity on my apparent instability. The tension only mounted when I finally found the courage to discuss the matter in more detail with the same older neighbor who'd once told me about the building's numerous renovations. He leaned against his doorframe, crossing his arms, and recounted an unsettling piece of history. Apparently, decades ago, he wasn't sure of the exact timeline. Someone reported a strange smell in the elevator after hours, combined with faint echoing voices in the stairwell there. Were rumors that certain areas had been sealed off or reconfigured during one of the renovations because the layout was unsettling. No official records were kept, but the neighbor insisted that the rumor was passed among residents for years, though no one ever pinpointed the cause. He said he personally never experienced anything similar, but he'd heard whispered gossip that the building felt haunted by past mistakes. I tried to remain calm as he spoke, yet my stomach churned with each detail. The idea of a repeating phenomenon, perfume, and voices made my skin. All I thanked him curtly and hurried back to my apartment, shutting the door as if bolting out some malignant presence. That night I hardly slept. My mind whirled with grotesque possibilities. What if the building itself had pockets of old air trapped behind walls releasing the perfume of a previous occupant? But how would that explain the voices and overactive imagination, stress-induced hallucinations? By the next week, I was startled awake more frequently than ever before. The voices grew louder, the hushed tones occasionally punctuated by what sounded like a shaky breath or a nervous laugh. The floral fragrance seeped into my dreams, tainting them with an unearthly quality. I'd wake drenched in sweat, an ache throbbing in my chest. Sometimes I felt certain my heart was racing so uncontrollably that it might burst. Yet I never found a single trace of another person in the corridor, one particularly stormy evening. The elevator itself seemed to groan under the strain of decades' worth of rust. Thunder rumbled through the city streets, and a fine drizzle turned into a pounding torrent. By the time I got home, stepping into the lobby, I detected that overbearing perfume before I even reached the elevator doors. My fingers grew cold, the hair on the back of my neck. Bristling instinct told me to take the stairs, but my exhausted legs revolted at the thought of trudging up 8 lights. I mustered my nerve and entered the elevator the moment the door slid shut with a tortured screech. The lights inside flickered. My heart thudded as I fidgeted with the control panel. Every breath tasted of rancid blossoms. The elevator lurched upward, and I braced myself against the wall, feeling as though the narrow space was growing even tighter. With each passing floor, the perfume intensified, attacking my lungs, my vision blurred, tears collecting at the corners of my eyes. Suddenly, I felt a slight pressure against my shoulder, like an invisible hand brushing me. It was the faintest suggestion of touch, but it sent me into a panic. I slammed the emergency stop button in a blind frenzy. The elevator shuddered, halting between floors. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my mind screamed that I was trapped. The overhead light flickered again, and for half a second I thought I saw a blurred outline of something. Someone standing next to me, but the light stabilized, and there was nothing. My entire body shook as I released the emergency stop, letting the elevator crawl the rest of the way. When the doors parted, I almost fell out into the corridor. There was no one around, no sign of movement yet. The perfume lingered in the stagnant air. I half stumbled, half ran to my apartment. Locking myself inside without a second glance, leaning against the door, I tried to steady my breathing. My skin felt clammy, tears burned at my eyes as adrenaline spiked in my veins. I realized with dawning horror that I was beginning to doubt my own sanity rationally. I knew there couldn't be a phantom presence inside that elevator, but I couldn't shake the dread that I'd felt something there. Desperate for answers, I scoured old newspaper archives online, seeking any reference to incidents in my building. I found only vague mentions of structural alterations, some speculation about hidden rooms, but no definitive story. Sometime after midnight, I gave up sleep, eventually claimed me, but not before the hiss of whispering voices and the swirl of that floral scent invaded the edges of my consciousness. As the weeks dragged on, my sense of isolation grew. I withdrew from social events, avoided eye contact with neighbors in the hallway. Each new day felt like a ticking clock counting down to the next disturbing experience. My nights became a dreaded battleground between my rational self and whatever was lurking in the shadows. I'd lay awake, muscles taut, every nerve on high alert for the slightest creak of a floorboard or flicker of light under the door. One evening, I resolved to confront the situation, head and armed with a flashlight and my phone. I decided to walk the corridors after dark. My heart thumped erratically as I paced the empty hall. The overhead lamps cast an anemic glow, warping my shadow into elongated shapes that wavered with each step. Dust motes drifted in the stale air. I approached the far end where a corner turned sharply. The murmuring started again so close it felt like I could reach out and touch the speakers. My stomach clenched and my lungs seized. I forced my legs to keep moving. Rounding the corner, I found only more peeling walls and flickering lights. Yet the voices didn't fade. It was as though they followed just behind me. I couldn't bear it anymore. I broke into a run, my footsteps pounding against the worn floor until I was back at my door, fumbling with the key. My throat was raw from breathing too hard, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. That was the moment I decided I had to leave whatever was happening in this building. I was convinced it was beyond me. I gathered my essentials the next day, stuffing clothes and personal items into a couple of suitcases. Everything felt urgent, as if some unspoken deadline was looming. I intended to seek out a friend's couch or a short-term rental, anything to avoid another night in that claustrophobic apartment. But by the time I returned that evening to finalize my departure, a new storm raged through the city. Rattling the ancient windows, stepping into the corridor with my luggage in tow, I nearly gagged on the thick haze of perfume that assaulted me. It was the strongest it had ever been, more nauseating than any other time, as if every single droplet of that scent had converged in this narrow hallway. My eyes watered and I tasted vile. The corridor light flickered ominously, throwing grotesque shadows on the walls. I felt that presence again, an invisible weight in the air pressing in from all sides. My arms trembled so fiercely that I could hardly keep my grip on the suitcase handles. I forced myself to keep moving. Inching toward the elevator, my mind screamed at me to take the stairs, but I felt an urgent compulsion to see if the elevator would manifest that presence. One last time, I pressed the call button, the metal doors creaking open to reveal a dim interior. The perfume rushed out like a cloud, My lungs spasmed, and for a moment I swore I heard the faintest intake of breath as if someone else was suffocating in that stifling smell. 2, I stepped inside, my legs quivering. The ride down was interminable. Each floor we passed felt like another layer of tension compressing my chest. Sweat trickled down my temples. I tried to ignore the flickering light overhead, but my eyes kept darting to it. I could feel every nerve in my body coiled, ready to snap. When the elevator finally reached the ground floor, it shuddered violently. The doors groaned open, revealing the lobby. My heart seized. The entire area was plunged into an eerie half-darkness. The only illumin coming from the sporadic flashes of lightning outside the building's entrance was just steps away, and I sprinted toward it, dragging my suitcases behind me, refusing to look back. Rain pelted my face as I stepped into the street, but the sudden rush of cool, fresh air felt like salvation. I stood there for a moment under the storm, letting the rain drench me, letting it wash away that oppressive stench. My limbs still trembled and my breath came out in ragged gulps. I was free from the building, from whatever unexplainable force clung to those corridors, yet a creeping sense of unease remained. As I caught my reflection in a puddle at the curb, I noticed how pale and shaken I looked, my eyes wide with lingering terror. Even now in a rented room across town, I can't banish the memory of that floral scent or those whispered voices. Some nights I startle awake, convinced I smell that perfume again. Convinced I hear muffled conversations just outside my door. I can't be sure if it's truly gone or if it has attached itself to my thoughts. The paranoia still clings to me, a ghost of fear that reminds me some doors once open can never really be closed. And every time it rains, I feel that phantom presence settle around me like a damp chill, suggesting that the building secret and whatever moves behind its narrow corridors and stale air remains unresolved. The thought that it could someday call me back beckoned me into its silent gloom claw at my mind, and I can't tell which possibility is more horrifying, that the experience was real or that it was all in my head. Either way, I cannot forget it. I can still smell that perfume dread on my clothes, even when there's no one around to wear it. I remember the chill in the air the first time I stepped onto the cabin's porch. It was the kind of cold that seeped through my jacket and clung to my skin, refusing to let go. The sun was sinking behind the tall pines, and the light cast peculiar shadows across the wooden walls. A wind hissed through the trees, carrying the faint scent of damp moss and rotting leaves. Something about that moment felt wrong, as if the darkness had been waiting for me, silently anticipating my arrival. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe the tension of the past few weeks was distorting my senses, yet I couldn't ignore the uneasy flutter in my stomach or the sharp prickle at the back of my neck that made me hesitate before unlocking the front door. It had been a month since I signed the lease. The owner was oddly eager to rent it out, offering a bargain on the condition that I agreed to keep the place in good repair. Having dealt with enough chaos in the city, I was desperate for a quiet sanctuary where I could finally breathe the next available. Place turned out to be this small log cabin half an hour away from any sign of civilization. No neighbors, no stores, no traffic, just the relentless hush of the forest. It sounded perfect at the time. The day I moved in, I noticed something peculiar about the layout. Everything was in decent shape. A modest kitchen, a cramped bedroom, a living area with a large window facing the pines, and a back room leading to a narrow staircase going down to the basement. Initially, I didn't think much of it until I realized the basement door was locked from the inside. It had a simple metal latch that could only be bolted from downstairs, yet the key was hanging from a small peg on the wall like it was waiting for me. It felt bizarre, but I shrugged it off. Maybe the previous tenant had found it more convenient to store the key there. I decided not to open the basement right away. I was still juggling boxes and needed to get settled that first week. Everything seemed normal enough. I spent my days reorganizing furniture, wiping away layers of dust, and stocking the kitchen with canned goods. The nights, however, were unsettling in a subtle way. The wind groaned and whistled through the nearby pines, creating an otherworldly chorus that kept me on edge. There were moments when the silence in the cabin felt almost too complete, as if the entire world had ceased to exist. Outside my rickety walls, now and then I caught myself holding my breath, ears straining for the faintest sound. I wasn't sure what I was hoping or fearing to hear. My nerves felt raw, but I told myself it was only the adjustment period, the seclusion, the new environment, and the memory of why I had to leave the city in the first place all weigh on me. I tried to stay busy reading or tinkering with small repairs the cabin needed. Whenever I passed by that locked basement door, I felt a tug of curiosity mixed with unease. Sometimes I sensed a draft of cold air wafting from the crack beneath the door, carrying a stale scent that reminded me of damp earth and old wood, though nothing overtly. Sinister happened. A small voice in the back of my mind warned me that something wasn't right down there. I started experiencing difficulty sleeping by the end of my first week lying in bed. I felt as if the entire Eyre cabin were alive, creaking and moaning in the darkness. Shadows projected by moonlight danced across the ceiling in elongated shapes that seemed almost alive. One night I caught a glimpse of a shape in the hallway, but when I flicked on the lamp, it vanished. My heart hammered in my chest and my legs tingled with pins and needles. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, though every instinct screamed. Otherwise, things escalated about 10 days in. I woke up one night to a muffled thumping. It was a dull, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere below the floorboards. I froze my breath, shallow ears straining to locate the origin. The only place it could have come from was the basement. After a few moments, the noise subsided and I was left with an oppressive silence. My shirt clung to my back, drenched in cold sweat. I remember staring at the ceiling, too terrified to move, convinced that if I so much as set foot on the floor, something would grab my ankles from beneath the cracks. The next day, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just the old house settling wood, tends to contract and expand with temperature changes. Or so I reasoned. Still, there was no explaining the intense dread I felt. I called an acquaintance in town to ask for recommendations about local contractors, thinking I could have someone come check the structure. He seemed puzzled that I was concerned about the foundation after just a couple of weeks, but assured me he'd spread the word. I got off the call feeling slightly reassured, though not entirely convinced there wasn't something else at play as night fell. That sense of foreboding returned heavier than ever. The wind outside had died down, leaving the world in suffocating quiet. I sat by the small fireplace, the flickering flames casting unsettling shapes across the walls. My eyes kept drifting toward the door leading to the basement, compelled by a mix of fear and fascination. Something in me insisted I at least test the lock, so I walked over, feeling the creak of every floorboard beneath my feet. Heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The key hung on the peg like a silent invitation, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Yet instead, I simply pressed my ear to the door. At first there was silence, then my blood turned to ice as I heard a subtle scratching noise, distant but distinct. It sounded like something dragging across the floor, a slow, deliberate scuff that set every hair on my body on end. My breathing grew ragged and I yanked myself away from the door, stumbling backward in panic. I spent that night on the couch, too anxious to close my eyes. Hours passed in a blur of dread, but eventually exhaustion got the better of me and I slipped into a light, uneasy sleep. Just before dawn, I jolted awake with my heart in my throat. The floorboards beneath me were vibrating with a methodical, heavy tread. Footsteps paced and deliberate, each thud resonated through my bones, sending my pulse into a frenetic gallop. Summoning every ounce of courage, I leapt up, seized the key from the wall, and flipped on every light I could find. With trembling fingers, I unlatched the basement door. A wave of musty air struck me like a warning, thick with the stench of old dirt and stagnant water. I stood there, unable to move for several seconds, my legs weak, sweat trickling down my temple. The footsteps had stopped, or at least I couldn't hear them anymore. The darkness beyond the doorway seemed to breathe an inky void that threatened to swallow me whole. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I whispered to myself that I had to see it through. I was tired of being at the mercy of whatever lurked down there. My stomach churned and a hot flush of adrenaline coursed through me. Still, I forced myself to descend the wooden steps, groaned under my weight. Each creak echoing through the confined space. The air was stale and thick, pressing in on me like a physical force. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the faint sound of dripping water resonated somewhere in the darkness. The beam of my flashlight revealed concrete walls and a cracked floor covered in a thin layer of dust. Shelves lined one side of the room, stacked with old tools and rusted metal. Parts, the place looked deserted, no sign of any intruder, yet something felt undeniably wrong. A sense of being watched crawled over my skin as though eyes in the dark were following my every move. My breath was coming in quick bursts, and the flashlight trembled in my grasp. I kept scanning each corner, expecting some shape to leap out, but there was nothing, only emptiness and a suffocating dread that hung in the air like a cloud of noxious gas. Despite seeing no one, the oppressive feeling intensified. My skin prickled and my heart thudded like a war drum. I remember thinking that perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me. Perhaps I thought I was succumbing to paranoia in my isolation after a few minutes that felt like hours. I retreated back upstairs. I double-checked the lock this time, securing it from my side. Even though I confirmed the basement was empty, I couldn't shake the feeling that something remained down there, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. My nerves were so fray that even the faint hum of the refrigerator made me jump. The entire cabin seemed to close in on me, every shadow twisting into a potential threat. Over the next few days, I attempted to maintain a routine, telling myself I had to stay grounded. I replaced a faulty kitchen cabinet hinge, reorganized a small stack of old magazines left by a previous occupant, and took short walks around the property. When daylight allowed, the forest itself was eerie in its stillness. Pine needles carpeted the ground, muffling every step, and the towering trees blocked out large swaths of sunlight. Even outside, I felt as if unseen eyes were fixed on me. My chest felt perpetually tight, and I found myself breathing shallowly more often than not. Bracing for the next unexplainable sound, during my walks, I noticed odd patches of disturbed earth around the property's perimeter. They looked as if something had been digging just below the surface. I couldn't be certain. It might have been animals or simple soil erosion. Yet the sight made my stomach twist each night. I practically barricaded myself inside the cabin, double-locking doors and windows. Sleep has remained elusive, haunted by the memory of those footsteps. Eventually, I had to confront my growing suspicion that I was losing my grip on reality. I caught myself questioning the simplest things, whether a door had really been left open, or if the light I turned off was actually still on. Occasionally, I would catch movement from the corner of my eye, only to find an empty corridor. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked haggard eyes, ringed with dark CES hair. Unkempt from restless nights, every muscle in my body felt knotted, my neck stiff from constant tension. One especially restless night, I decided I needed to go downstairs again, as if facing the basement might quell the fear that had latched onto my mind. The cabin was silent, and the moon cast a pale glow through the living room window. I forced myself to descend those stairs, flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other. Heart pounding so loudly I thought it might wake the dead. The basement was as still and suffocating as before. Dust motes swirled in the flashlight's beam. I paused, scanning the area. It appeared unchanged until I noticed the faintest outline in the dust on the floor. Footprints that were clearly larger than mine, leading to a far corner. My gut tightened with a visceral terror that nearly made me drop the flashlight. I followed the footprints cautiously each step, bat ling. My nerves, they stopped at a section of the wall where several wooden planks seemed to have been recently shifted. My hand shook as I reached out to touch the boards. They were loose, as if someone or something had been prying them apart. A wave of nauseating dread washed over me. I felt that if I continued, I would discover something I couldn't unsee. Yet I found myself compelled to press on, driven by a twisted mix of curiosity and fear. With painstaking taking care, I wedged the crowbar under one of the loose planks and tugged. The plank came free, revealing a dark gap behind it. A foul odor, sharp and earthy, assaulted my nostrils. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it inside. What I saw nearly stopped my heart, a makeshift alcove filled with bizarre markings on the walls, symbols etched in some jagged, chaotic pattern like a language I couldn't decipher. The lines swirled and interacted, forming shapes that seemed to twist into themselves. Seeing them made my vision swim as though my mind couldn't quite process their design. On the dirt floor lay a cluster of melted candles, stubs barely recognizable under a coat of dust. Clearly someone had been down here performing rituals or something far more disturbing. A sudden vibration rippled through the concrete floor, a faint trembling that threatened to upend my composure. My heart thundered in my chest and an electric fear coursed through my veins. I had to get out. Gripping the flashlight in a white-knuckled fist, I clambered back up the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. Once I reached the top, I slammed the door behind me and threw the latch, adrenaline surging so powerfully my hands tingled. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the fireplace, crowbar in one hand, phone in the other. My breath came in shallow spurts and my mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I considered calling the owner to demand an explanation, but the idea of hearing a casual denial or a half-hearted dismissal felt unbearable. Instead, I waited for dawn eyes fixed on the basement door. My back ached from tension and sweat trickled down my spine intermittently. Each minute stretched into eternity when the first faint light of morning filtered through the windows. I decided I couldn't stay there another day. The cabin was no sanctuary. It was a trap, and I sensed that whatever lurked in its depths would not let me rest as long as I remained. My nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I packed the bare essentials in a rush, every small noise making me jerk in alarm. My breath was unsteady and my hands still shook from the night's revelations before leaving. I walked to the basement door. One last time, standing there in the hazy morning light with sweat cooling on my brow, the memory of those footprints in the dust, the strange symbols behind the plank, and the heavy footsteps I'd heard night after night swarmed my thoughts. I recalled the oppressive darkness, the feeling of being watched, the smell of damp earth, and something else I couldn't name. I remembered the vibration underfoot and the way my heart lurched when I realized I was not alone, whether it was a presence from another realm or an echo of my own shattered psyche. I didn't care anymore, I just knew it wanted me gone, or worse, wanted me to stay. I felt an almost sentient malice emanating from the lower level of that cabin, a silent menace waiting in the shadows, hungry for fear. Without another glance, I backed away, locked the front door behind me, and left the key on the porch where the owner would easily find it. My hands were clammy, my breathing rapid, but I felt a grim resolve settle over me as I got into my car. I could practically taste the metallic tang of adrenaline on my tongue, pulling away from the cabin. My muscles began to relax only when I saw the place shrink in the rearview mirror even now. As I write this in the safety of a borrowed apartment in town, I can't banish the cabin from my mind. The memory slithers back whenever night falls and the wind howls through the alleyways, sounding so much like the wind in those pines. I still feel as though something has followed me, L lingering on the edge of my vision, waiting for me to let my guard down. The nightmares haven't stopped in them. I'm descending those basement stairs over and over again, searching for something elusive and dread-inducing each time I wake, with my heart hammering a thin layer of sweat on my skin, half expecting to see footprints on the floor or symbols scratched into my walls. I don't know precisely what haunts that cabin, nor do I want to find out whatever it is. I'm certain it thrives on fear, on isolation, and on the unsettling darkness that can drive a person to question their own sanity. The last image etched into my memory is the sight of that door at the bottom of the stairs, blackness curling around. It like a living shadow, and the dreadful certainty that even if I returned in daylight, that feeling of malevolent watchfulness would still be there. Waiting, that realization has left a lasting knot in my stomach, a persistent impression that not everything in this world can be understood or explained, and that sometimes it's best to leave it that way. The sound of the back door rattling against its frame still echoes in my mind. When I think about those nights, I remember the first time it happened. A sudden tremor like a hush of air slipping in around the edges. Even now, my skin prickles at the recollection that corridor dark and narrow always felt off, like it carried an uneasy weight that pressed against my chest. The moment I set foot there, I had arrived at my friend's home full of gratitude, expecting a peaceful stay that would help me cut down on costs. Instead, I ended up with nights so tense that I barely slept. Wide awake and counting the seconds until dawn, I am a man who has always considered himself rational. I believe in evidence and logical explanations. When my friend offered his spare room, I jumped at the chance. The house itself was simple, one story with a living room that connected to a tight hallway. At the far end of that hallway stood a wooden door leading to the backyard. My friend's room was on the left side. As you walked in close to the living room, mine was at the very end of the hall, right next to that backyard door. I initially liked the location. It offered a semblance of privacy, and I thought it would be nice to have quick access to fresh air if I needed it. But it took only a few nights for me to realize just how isolated I felt down there. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The floors creaked a bit. Old wood does that. And occasionally I heard sounds from outside. I assumed they were stray animals, maybe cats or small critters rustling in the bushes. My friend assured me the neighborhood was safe. He stressed that the door in the hallway was always locked and that the backyard was surrounded by a tall fence, making any intruder unlikely. For the first few nights, I slept well, only waking to the gentle hum of the ceiling fan or the soft shuffle of my friend moving around in the kitchen early in the morning. Everything changed, however, on the fourth night. I had gone to bed as usual, feeling slightly restless, but chalking it up to the stress of adjusting to someone else's home around 2 in the morning. I shot up in bed with a jolt, my heart hammering in my chest. It felt as if someone had slammed the door in the hallway, but the sound was oddly muted, like a door pressed shut with care rather than force. I lay there trying to slow my breathing. A faint glow from the streetlight outside filtered in through a gap in the curtains, painting the walls with a grim yellowish tinge. My ears strained, searching for any indication of movement, footsteps, the shuffle of clothing. Anything, but there was only silence. I eventually forced myself out of bed, hoping to confirm I was alone in that corridor. When I stepped into the hallway, the floor felt cold beneath my bare feet, and I noticed my arms were clammy with sweat. My skin tingled with each slow step I took. As I made my way to the door, I realized the handle was securely locked, just as my friend had promised. Trying not to wake him, I turned on the hallway. Light the bulb overhead was weak, barely illuminating the floor in front of me, making the corners of the corridor seem deep and darker. My throat felt tight as I scanned the walls and the door for any sign of tampering, but there was nothing out of place. No footprints, no scratches, no disturbed dust. It all looked exactly as it should the next morning. I mentioned it to my friend over breakfast. He simply shrugged and said he had heard nothing. He also suggested that I might be experiencing some stress. Maybe a nightmare that felt too real. I didn't doubt it could be stress. Yet the unsettled feeling clung to me. That sense of an invisible presence standing outside my door stayed with me through the entire day. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But once the sun set and I found myself back in that dimly lit hallway, the prickle of unease returned more potent than before. On the fifth night, the noise woke me again. This time, a subtle rattling as if someone was testing the locked handle from the outside. My heart rate surged and a heavy tightness settled in my chest. The air in the room felt stifling, thick with an unspoken threat. I swallowed hard, trying to gather the courage to get up. My mind buzzed with conflicting impulses. Stay hidden under the blankets or confront whoever or whatever might be on the other side of that door. Finally, I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. Every muscle in my body tensed as I stood, my ears pounding with my own pulse. This time I didn't turn on the light in the hallway. Instead, I crept forward, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. I wanted to remain hidden, thinking if there truly was someone there, I might catch them in the act. As I neared the door, I heard a faint creak like weight shifting on the old wooden floor. My throat went dry. I pressed my palm against the wall to steady myself, feeling my heart the sting against my ribcage. Then, in a sudden burst of courage, I flipped the light switch. The corridor flooded with that same weak glow, revealing nothing but the familiar emptiness. The handle was still locked, motionless. I exhaled a tremor in my breath. My mind struggled to reconcile the absolute certainty of having heard something with the evidence before me. Showing no one there, I started to notice other details after that. The way the shadows in the hall seemed to lengthen at night, forming shapes that made me question my peripheral vision. The house had an odd smell that I couldn't place slightly damp like rotting leaves after a heavy rain. I asked my friend if the house ever had issues with the plumbing or mold, and he gave me a confused look insisting everything was in perfect condition. He seemed genuinely perplexed, telling me nothing felt out of the ordinary to him. His confusion left me even more unsettled because I couldn't dismiss these occurrences as normal quirks of an old house as a couple. More nights passed, the presence shifted from mere sounds to something more intimate. I began hearing a whisper, low and breathy, brushing against my ears in the stillness. It always seemed to linger right outside my bedroom door as if calling my name. The voice was muffled, but I recognized the faint pattern of my name in the syllables. Each time I heard it, a jolt of cold electricity shot up my spine and my hands started shaking. I told my friend about the whispers. He seemed concerned but maintained he had never heard anything of the sort. Though he tried to offer reassurance, I could sense he was growing skeptical of my reports, and it only fueled my paranoia. I questioned whether I was losing my grip. Perhaps exhaustion was playing tricks on me. Sleep became nearly impossible. I'd lie in bed, eyes glued to the door, ears tuned to the slightest noise. My breathing would be shallow, and I could feel my heart thrumming at my temples. Even when my body was desperate for rest, my mind refused to let go. I imagined footsteps sliding across the floor outside or the creak of someone slowly shifting weight behind the wall. I stayed on alert, waiting for the doorknob to jiggle again, for that hushed whisper to breathe out my name. On several occasions, I forced myself to open the door quickly, hoping I might finally catch the source of that dreadful presence. But each time the corridor was lifeless and silent. I hated how the overhead light cast shaky shadows that seemed to pulse with each flicker of the bulb. Eventually, I started examining the backyard during daylight hours, looking for footprints, or signs that someone might be sneaking in the yard. Was mostly dirt, with a few patches of grass and old stepping stones leading to a small shed. There were no footprints besides my own, and my friend's. The fence seemed sturdy enough with no obvious gaps or holes. Yet every fiber in my being insisted that something was getting inside at night. My rational mind warred with my instincts, and I felt my sanity teetering as if on the edge of a cliff one afternoon. While my friend was at work, I decided to do a more thorough search. I checked the shed, rummaged through dusty old boxes of tools, but found nothing unusual with the door to the backyard wide open. I stood in the sunlight and tried to imagine how someone or something could slip inside the door. Itself was heavy, equipped with a solid lock and a deadbolt. It made no sense that it could be opened without leaving any trace still. The fear eating away at me at night was real, and I couldn't dismiss it as a mere product of my imagination. Every night after that felt more oppressive. My body would tense the moment dusk arrived, as if anticipating an attack. The whispering grew more frequent, no longer limited to the small hours of the morning. Sometimes it seemed to occur just after midnight. Other times, closer to dawn, I began seeing flickers of motion in the corner of my eye. A shadow darting away when I turned my head, a silhouette shifting near the back door. When I glanced up from my phone more than once, I gasped involuntarily, chest tight with panic, only to find the core corridor once again empty when I dared to look properly. I started questioning the layout of the house. The corridor felt longer than usual at times, stretching before me like a tunnel. The small lamp in my room sometimes flickered for no apparent reason, and the darkness swelled in the corners, leaving me feeling as though I were being watched from multiple angles. My mouth would go dry whenever I heard that silent voice, and I noticed my hands trembling even in daylight, my nerves constantly on edge. During one particularly harrowing night, I woke up to the soft scrape of something against the door. It sounded like nails or a piece of metal trailing across the wood. My heart slammed in my chest so hard it hurt. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I could taste the metallic tang of adrenaline in my mouth. I wanted to call out, but my throat seized. My mind spun in panicked circles. Was I truly in danger, or was this some grotesque hallucination injured by stress and lack of sleep in the morning? I didn't even have to ask my friend if he had heard anything. The look on his face told me he hadn't. He was growing worried, though, asking if I needed to see a doctor or if I had been under too much pressure lately. I told him I was fine, but deep down I felt a growing isolation. I was the only one who saw and heard these things, which meant no one could validate my experiences. That loneliness weighed on me like a heavy shroud. I tried to ward off the dread by rationalizing each new occurrence. The rattling door could be the wind. The whispers might be my imagination. The shadows just tricks of poor lighting. But every time I tried to cling to logic, I felt the tangible presence in that corridor, as if something malevolent was biding its time. I could sense it. In the silence that followed each creak and the sudden drop in temperature when I stood by the door and the tang of static on the air that made my hair stand on end. My reflection in the mirror on the closet door looked gaunter each day. Purple shadows appeared beneath my eyes, and I noticed a faint tremble in my hands that never entirely went away one night. Near the end of my stay, I decided I could no longer live with the uncertainty. I resolved to confront whatever was haunting my nights. I prepared myself mentally, bracing for the possibility that I'd discover nothing or something I couldn't understand. The tension was unbearable as I waited in bed, fully dressed, covers pulled up just to my waist, a small flashlight hidden under the sheets, every minute stretched on for hours. My breathing was shallow and my body felt coiled like a spring. Sometime after midnight, I heard the soft click of the back door's lock as though someone outside was carefully turning the knob. My pulse lurched. I swung my legs off the bed, gripped the flashlight, and crept to the door. My heart hammered against my ribs, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway was submerged in darkness, shapes and shadows blending into one another. I paused, straining my ears, and heard it again. A shuffle of movement, a faint whisper that could have been my name, my insides. Twisted with dread, but I flicked on the flashlight and rushed forward, yanking open my bedroom door with a burst of determination. The corridor was illuminated by the flashlight's beam, a bright circle amid the gloom. I aimed the light at the back door and froze. The handle was turning slowly but visibly. My entire body went rigid with fear. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and for a moment I couldn't move. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, I lunged for the handle, pressed the lock firmly, and wrenched it to ensure it was still in place. The movement stopped. The door was secure, not budging even a fraction of an inch. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation that just beyond it, something stood waiting. Listening, my knees threatened to buckle, and I leaned against the wall. Flashlight trembling in my hand, a deep swirling panic churned in my gut, making me lightheaded. I questioned if I was losing my mind, if I had become so consumed by fear that my senses were betraying me. My skin crawled as I felt a breeze impossible given that the door was locked. It brushed pee past me as though something unseen had slipped by. I swung the flashlight around in alarm, but there was no figure, no movement, just an inescapable sensation that something lingered in the very air I breathed. I made a decision in that moment. I needed to leave, regardless of whether I could afford a different place to stay. It had become clear that I couldn't remain in that room, in that hallway, near that door. My friend might believe me or not, but the relentless weight of dread had become too much to bear. Early the next morning, I packed my belongings in haste. I kept catching glimpses of motion from the corner of my eye as I moved around the corridor, but I refused to look directly. My heart rate hadn't slowed since the night's encounter, and I was covered in a cold sweat that clung to my clothes. Even my friend's presence didn't ease my distress. I felt more isolated than ever. I told him I couldn't stay any longer, that I needed to find my own space. He looked concerned, but didn't protest. I left the house that day, my stomach knotted with anxiety. My pulse fluttering like a trapped bird. As I drove away, I felt a nauseating mixture of relief and lingering terror. I knew that whatever had been lurking in that corridor might remain there, or more disturbingly, might follow me wherever I went. Even now, when I close my eyes, I still feel the hush of that malevolent whisper lingering in my ears. I sometimes wake at night in a different home heart, pounding, convinced I can hear a handle turning in the silence. Perhaps it was all a series of misinterpretations, a product of a mind pushed too far by restlessness and paranoia. Or maybe there truly was something in that hallway waiting just beyond the door for the right moment to reveal itself. I still haven't found a satisfying answer, but the tension, the sense of being watched, the racing heartbeat in the middle of the night, all of that remains imprinted in my psyche. Every creak in my new apartment makes me sit bolt upright, and I can't pass a dark corridor without feeling an uneasy chill. Maybe in the end, the real horror is not knowing what was real and what was imagined. All I can say for certain is that sometimes in the quiet hours I catch myself straining to hear if that back door is being tested again, straining to catch the faint call of my name in the dark. Ever wondering if I truly escaped, I arrived on a stormy afternoon, and the moment I turned the key in the lock, the wind seemed to howl in protest. Everything about the house felt old, vaguely hostile. The sea spray had battered the wooden walls for decades, leaving jagged scars and a salty residue on the windows. Even before I stepped inside, I could sense a kind of restless energy in the air, like a held breath that never fully released the dim winter sun. Barely lit the interior, and shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor. A shiver went through me, and I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from a deeper apprehension that I was not alone in this place. I had chosen this secluded beach house to find peace and focus. For my writing, convinced that isolation was what I needed to birth my next book. The off-season calm seemed ideal. No chatter of tourists, no traffic. Only the crash of waves and the occasional gull overhead. I hoped to capture something profound from this quiet, something that would seep into my pages. The house itself was advertised as simple but charming, with a rustic beauty that promised to spark creative energy. The owner had assured me it would be free of distraction during the winter months. At first glance, it seemed they were right. All around stretched an empty coastline under a sky bruised used by iron-gray clouds. My first week there was oddly silent, yet I appreciated the stillness. Every morning I woke to the sound of the tide receding from the shore, leaving behind streaks of seaweed on the wet sand at night. I would struggle to keep the fire burning in the old brick fireplace while the wind pummeled the windows like an agitated intruder. Still, there was a rare solace in solitude. I filled my days with writing, occasionally pacing the creaking floors to get my blood moving by midweek. I had convinced myself the house was a peaceful retreat. The only signs of other human life were two fishermen I saw from a distance. One afternoon, far down the coastline, barely more than silhouettes once the second week began. That comfortable stillness started to unravel. It began with faint rhythmic taps against the living room wall. At first, I thought it was just wind-blown debris, branches scraping against the exterior, but something about it was too measured, too deliberate. The knocks came in short bursts, almost like a code. I remember pausing my typing heart, pounding in my chest. Listening intently, I got up from my chair, approached the wall, and felt the faintest vibration, as though someone or something was knocking from outside. The moment I opened the front door to check, the tapping ceased. Darkness greeted me. The wind laughed at my face. I peered around the side of the house and saw nothing but my own shadow under the dull security light. No footprints, no sign of a prowler over the next 2 days. Those knocks grew bolder, always starting when dusk settled. I found myself bracing for that first tap. Each evening, hands clammy on my typewriter or laptop. My nerves were wound so tightly that I jumped at every creak of the floorboards, every sway of the shutters. My chest tightened with each new round of taps, and I sometimes felt as though the house itself was testing my boundaries. Several times I crept outside, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it could burst from my ribcage, only to discover an empty yard. The ocean's roar, muted in the winter air, offered no comfort, just an unending sense that something was waiting. Then came the whispers, or what felt like whispers. Late at night, when the wind howled strongest, I would hear voices in the backyard. It sounded like 2 or 3 people standing just beyond the range of the porch light, speaking in hushed, urgent tones each time I froze. Where I stood, unable to tear my gaze away from the dark window, my pulse thumped so violently I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Sometimes I'd gather the courage to step outside, my breath ragged, a flashlight in my trembling hand. but the yard would be empty. Not a single sign of footprints in the loose dirt. No parted blades of grass, no footprints in the patchy sand. Beyond. And still, every nerve in my body insisted I was being watched. Paranoia took root. I started to question whether I was sleeping enough or if the isolation was preying on my mind. A friend had once told me that too much solitude can make the imagination cannibalize itself. Perhaps I was just losing touch, yet the sounds were so real, the sensation of presence so tangible. My mouth went dry whenever those tapping noises broke the silence. My breathing grew erratic when I searched the yard and felt eyes on my back. There were moments I found myself shaking uncontrollably, convinced something stood right behind me, just out of sight. I tried to rationalize, telling myself it was some curious local or a prankster when I contacted the property owner in a trembling voice and explained the disturbances. They sounded unconvinced, though polite. They assured me the house was known for creaks in the winter, that the wind sometimes produced eerie phenomena. They said no one in town ventured that far up the beach. In the off-season, the caretaker, when I briefly managed to reach them, simply insisted that no intruder had been reported there. Before I hung up, feeling unsettled, unconvinced, and with a new wave of nausea rising in my stomach. My writing began to suffer. The words felt forced, or they didn't come at all. The once inspiring crash of the waves now seemed ominous. Like a relentless warning at night, I would sit in the living room, the fireplace crackling, trying to force calmness into my breathing when the tapping started again. I felt an involuntary clench in my gut. The walls themselves felt alive. Thrumming with each knock, I stared at those wooden panels, watching the dancing shadows cast by the fire. My lungs constricted and sweat beaded at my temples. I can't express how oppressive the atmosphere became, like the very air was laced with dread. One particularly windy night, the whispers were louder, more distinct. It sounded as though they came from the small grove of trees in the backyard. Half bent by the seaside storms, my entire body shook and sweat ran cold down my spine. I was certain I could make out words, but they were spoken so softly and in such a broken cadence that I couldn't decipher their meaning for a moment. I thought I glimpsed a figure near the tree line, a darker shape against the night. My flashlight trembled in my hand, its beam unsteady as I searched the backyard. Every hair on my body stood on end. I felt a primal urge to flee, but I couldn't make my legs move. It became impossible to sleep in my bedroom. The walls felt too close. The windows seemed to rattle and groan, and the hush of the ocean turned malevolent in my ears. I moved my blankets into the living room, where I dozed off more from exhaustion than comfort. I began to have trouble distinguishing dreams from reality. One night, in a half-lucid state, I thought I heard the front door creak open. My heart pounded so heavily that I nearly leapt out of my skin. I lurched upright and stared into the darkness, convinced I would see a silhouette standing in the doorway, but the door was firmly shut, and the only sound I heard was my ragged breath tear staring at the silence. Days blurred together. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was pale, with dark circles under my eyes. I felt disconnected, as though part of me had retreated somewhere safer, while the rest was stuck in this waking nightmare. I began to dread dusk, that moment when the sun's final light bled away into the horizon. The sense of an unseen presence closing in was almost suffocating. I swore I could feel it behind me whenever I moved around the house at night. If I turned too quickly, my vision would distort, and I'd see shapes that vanished the moment I tried to focus. One evening, I discovered damp footprints inside the back door, a trail of water leading across the kitchen floor. My throat closed up with panic. I had searched for footprints outside countless times, always finding nothing. Yet here they were, blatant, leading from the threshold to the corner of the kitchen, where the footprint simply ended, as though the intruder had vanished into thin air. My heart felt like it was pounding against my eardrums. A wave of nausea rolled over me, and my legs nearly gave out. I forced myself to look under the table behind the counters, but I was alone. No sign of a person, and the footprints themselves. By the time I fumbled for my phone to take a picture, they had started to fade as if absorbed by the old wood. I stood there for what felt like ages, breath shallow, every muscle in my body rigid with terror. That night, the tension reached a crescendo. The wind tore at the walls and waves slammed against the shore with violent intensity. I was certain I heard footsteps circling the house, heavy and methodical. Crunching the gravel in the driveway, my chest burned with each breath. It felt like my lungs couldn't fully expand, as if the atmosphere was strangling me. I darted from window to window, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but all I could see was darkness. The boards beneath my feet groaned as though burdened by an invisible weight. My eyes prickled with tears. Equal parts fear and frustration, I could hardly think straight. My mind racing with possibilities. Was someone trying to break in? Was this place haunted, or was I truly descending into madness? I realized I had to leave. The decision struck me like a flare in the dark. My writing, my peace of mind, everything was unraveling. I abandoned the idea of finishing my book here. No creative spark was worth this nerve-shredding. Terror with trembling hands, I threw my clothes into my suitcase, barely able to fold them. My breath came in short gasps, and a clammy sweat coated my entire body. Even as I moved from room to room, I felt that presence loom behind me, as though it was trying to stop me from escaping. My heart hammered so violently that I worried I might collapse. A surge of primal courage pushed me to the front door the moment I stepped onto the porch. The wind slapped me hard, nearly knocking me back. It was as if the air itself resisted my departure. The wooden steps creaked, and I found the yard shrouded in swirling mist, the security light flickering ominously. The world beyond the house felt just as hostile as inside, but at least it was open. Not confining, I forced myself down the steps, suitcase rattling against the boards as I fumbled with my car keys. I heard a rhythmic tapping on the far wall of the house, distinct even over the raging wind. My blood ran cold. Something was there behind the building, repeating that same methodical pattern that had tormented me for nights. I couldn't bring myself to check. Instead, I jammed the key into the car door and slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut with shaky arms. My breath fogged the cold windshield, and my hands quivered on the steering wheel. I started the engine, nearly flooding it. In my haste, the headlights cut through the swirling mist, illuminating the path that led to the narrow coastal road. But as I pulled away, the beam briefly lit the side of the house for an instant, no more than a few seconds. I thought I saw a figure, a vague, elongated shape pressed against the weather-beaten boards where the tapping had come from. I froze, my foot hovering over the brack. My stomach lurched, and a spike of terror shot through me like an electrical current. The shape seemed to meld with the darkness itself, and then the headlights swung away. I didn't linger. I drove off, heart thundering, unwilling to look back. I spent the rest of the night in a roadside motel miles from the coast, even with a locked door and a lit hallway. Beyond it, I couldn't calm my nerves. Every scrape of a branch against the building's exterior made me jump. My entire body remained tense, ears straining for knocks or whispers that never came. Sleep was impossible. When I closed my eyes, I pictured those damp footprints fading on the old kitchen floor and that final glimpse of something clinging to the wall. I left at first light, never returning to that beach house in the days that followed. I tried to tell myself it was all a product of stress and overactive imagination, a perfect storm of isolation and fatigue. Yet I can't banish the memory of those measured taps, the hush of voices in the yard, the half-seen figure even now. My heart quickens whenever I recall that final night. A knowing unease coils in my gut, as though the presence I felt out there latched onto something deeper inside me, leaving behind a trace of itself, no matter how many times I try to write about it, to extract it from my mind and pin it onto the page. The dread remains. The beach house still stands by that lonely shore, battered by winter winds waiting. I have no desire to return, no urge to test my sanity against those walls again. Yet sometimes in the deepest hours of the night, I feel an unexplainable pull. My heartbeat quickens, my breathing grows shallow, and for one harrowing second, I think I hear that rhythmic tapping, soft, insistent, like a reminder that some doors once open can never be fully closed. The moment I stepped into that silent corridor, I felt the air growing thick around me like a cold hand pressing against my chest and urging me to turn back the overhead lights. Buzzed and flickered, casting restless shadows on the walls. I could feel my heartbeat accelerating, and I hadn't even reached the conference room yet. That place, once an archive room from decades ago, had an unsettling reputation. Colleagues whispered about strange noises late at night, about shadows moving past the frosted glass doors. I always brushed those rumors aside as exaggerated gossip until that particular evening when I experienced something that would forever reshape the way I think about the unseen forces lurking in quiet hallways. I was working as an administrative assistant in a clinic that had stood for several decades, a sturdy old building that had seen countless renovations. Despite its modern facade and updated technology, certain areas remained practically untouched, carrying vestiges of their past use. One of these areas was a large conference room on the second floor, a space that had once been the archive wing on most days. It sat empty, used only when the main conference room was booked. But that night it was my best option for going through a stack of papers I had to finalize before the week ended. I still remember the echo of my footsteps as I entered the conference room. The ceiling lights gave off a weak, pale glow that barely illuminated the corners. Old cabinets lined one wall, relics from the time when the room had been crammed with metal filing shelves. The distant sound of a loose vent rattling above added a layer of unease. Although I often found myself alone at night to finish last-minute tasks, that particular evening felt different from the start. There was a pressing sense of dread in the air, as if the building itself were trying to warn me away. I laid out the paperwork on a long rectangular table in the center of the room. The chairs around it were mismatched, some made of old leather with cracks and tears, others with vinyl coverings that squeaked under the slightest pressure I tried to settle in convincing myself that I was simply tired, that the weird feeling in my gut was just the result of too much coffee and not enough sleep. After a few minutes, I heard a distant metallic thud like a drawer being slammed shut down the hall. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe a janitor was still doing rounds, but the noise didn't sound casual. It had a strange echo to it, reverberating through the hallway, followed by an odd silence that seemed more profound than before. My heartbeat fluttered uncomfortably, and I noticed my mouth going dry. My mind raced to assure me that it was just the building settling, or a loose file drawer left precariously open. Somewhere I pressed on with my work, reading through forms, signing off on relevant documents, double-checking patient file numbers. All the while, I couldn't shake the unease that hung over me like a dark cloak. The ventilation overhead hissed, blowing out a current of stale air. I wondered if the HVAC system was malfunctioning again, but I brushed it off. Then I heard it a second time, that same metallic clang slightly louder. Now a tingling sensation spread across my scalp and my palms grew clammy. My eyes darted toward the door. I had closed it firmly when I came in, but I could see the small gap of light beneath it. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered. Each flicker sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. My breath grew uneven and my pulse pounded in my ears. I thought about going home right then, but I had a deadline, and leaving all that work undone would have caused more trouble than I wanted, so I forced myself to stay another half hour past without any major incident. Just the buzzing of the lights and my occasional sighs of frustration whenever I lost focus. I tried to keep my breathing steady, telling myself that old buildings have their quirks, but then the lights flickered again more aggressively this time, and I felt as though the air in the room had thickened even more. A wave of dizziness washed over me. My vision blurred at the edges. For a moment, I placed my hands on the table to steady myself, noticing a tremor in my fingers. The hum of the overhead fluorescent light seemed to grow louder. Bordering on a shrill whine, I got up to stretch my legs, thinking I'd shake off the sudden vertigo by moving around. My muscles felt tense, and I stretched my arms upward, rolling my shoulders. The air still felt oppressive, and the rattling vent above made an ominous clank as it turned off. The resulting silence was almost more unsettling than the noise had been with the HVAC shut down for a moment. The room grew uncomfortably still. I let out a shaky exhale, wiping sweat from my temples. Focusing on getting my work finished, I sat back down and tried to lose myself in the forms, but I couldn't stay absorbed for long. My concentration kept faltering, drawn away by the slightest creak or hum. My eyes darted around the room, scanning the corners where the light was weakest. At one point, I could have sworn I glimpsed a shifting shadow near the old cabinets, but it was gone in an instant. I thought maybe my eyesight was playing tricks on me, or the flickering lights had distorted my vision as I reached for a pen. I realized my hand was trembling. I tried to ignore it, but my body refused to calm down. There was a tension coiling in my stomach, and I could feel every muscle in my back growing rigid. Even the act of turning my head made the hair on my neck stand on end, as if I expected to see something lurking behind me. My skin felt clammy, and a chill ran down my spine that seemed to sink into my bones. I told myself I just needed to finish checking one last set of documents. Then I'd grab my things, lock up, and be gone, but right at that moment I heard that metallic clang again, except now it was alarmingly close, as though it came from right outside the door. My blood froze. I stayed motionless in my seat, barely breathing, my ears straining to pick up any hint of movement. The flickering lights above hummed in a sporadic rhythm. Almost like a heartbeat, I found myself unconsciously matching my breaths to the pulsing lights. Seconds ticked by in suffocating silence. I let out a slow breath, summoning the courage to stand up. My legs felt weak, as if I might collapse under my own weight. I walked toward the door with uncertain steps, each footfall echoing in that empty room. I pressed my ear to the door, hearing nothing but the faint crackle of electricity in the overhead fixture. With a trembling hand, I turned the doorknob and opened it just a crack. The hallway stretched out, dimly lit by only a few functioning bulbs. The thick hush in the corridor immediately mentally made me feel exposed, as though something hidden was watching from one of the dark corners. No other rooms on that floor were occupied at that hour, and there was no sign of the security guard. I forced a nervous chuckle, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Then I closed the door again and returned to my seat, my heart still pounding. I couldn't ignore the tension building in my chest, though my skin was prickling with the sensation of being watched. My throat felt tight, and each breath seemed to catch in my lungs. I resolved to power through the last bit of work as quickly as possible. My fingers fumbled on the keyboard, making mistakes. My eyes scanned the documents, but I could hardly comprehend the text. All I could think about was finishing and getting out of there. The lights flickered a third time, and that suffocating heaviness in the air returned. I felt a sudden drop in the temperature, as if a draft of icy wind had blown through the room. Yet the windows were sealed and the HVAC system was quiet. My breath came out in shallow gasps. The sensation of vertigo returned stronger than before, and I clutched the edge of the table to steady myself. I dared a quick glance at the door. It was definitely closed until, without warning, the double doors swung open with a slow, ominous creak. I could see into the hallway. Beyond a narrow slice of dim light that revealed nothing but emptiness. Yet the fear that stabbed through me was paralyzing. My pulse hammered and my lungs clenched as if I had just plunged into ice-cold water. I knew I had closed those doors firmly. They had latched. I was sure of it. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I fought the urge to run wildly, but something in my instincts screamed at me that I shouldn't remain in that place 1 second longer. My hands were sweating so much that my pen slipped from my grip and rolled noisily across the table, unable to bear it any longer. I snatched my briefcase, left the documents behind, and rushed out of the conference room. My footsteps echoed in the deserted hallway, and I almost stumbled over the uneven tiles near the elevator. My heart pounded so violently in my chest I wondered if I'd pass out the elevator ride. Down felt excruciatingly long. The old mechanism groaned and took its time, as if deliberately prolonging my anxiety. I kept looking at the overhead lights, half expecting them to flicker out at any moment, and traw me between floors. When the doors finally opened onto the lobby, I saw the security guard behind the desk. He looked up from a small TV he had been watching. I approached him, struggling to steady my breath. I tried to explain what had happened in the most coherent way possible, though my words felt jumbled. The guard's brows knitted, and he said he'd accompany me back upstairs to check without using many direct words. He indicated he found it odd that anyone else would be in the building. At this hour, he told me that as far as he knew, no one else had come in or out on his watch. We took the elevator up again, and my hands wouldn't stop trembling. My shirt clung to my back with cold sweat, and the close confines of the elevator intensified my claustrophobia. I kept imagining flickers of movement in the shiny metal walls. Arriving back on the second floor felt like stepping onto the set of a horror movie. The lights in the hallway were steady now, and no metallic banging echoed through the corridor as we approached the conference room. We found the double doors securely shut. The guard opened them and flicked on the light switch. Everything appeared ordinary. My scattered paperwork was sitting exactly as I had left it. My pen lying next to the papers. The air felt normal again, not heavy as before. If I hadn't lived through the unsettling moments earlier, I might have thought I'd hallucinated the entire episode. The guard gave me a cautious look, and I could sense his skepticism. He didn't say much. Just that maybe I was stressed, or that the old building sometimes messed with people's heads. Nonetheless, he offered to wait in the hall for a while, in case I needed more time to gather my belongings. I couldn't blame him. For not taking it too seriously, sometimes words fail to capture the weight of certain experiences. I stepped back into that conference room and glanced around. My muscles were still tight with residual fear, and I was on edge waiting for something else to happen. My breath remained shallow and my pulse was still high. This time there were no flickering lights, no banging drawers yet. Deep inside, I felt that the room's oppressive presence lingered silent but not gone. I tried to move swiftly, sorting the papers into a neat stack and shoving them into my briefcase. My vision tunneled momentarily and my knees threatened to buckle. I forced myself to focus on the small tasks, putting papers away, double-checking the desk, turning off the lights. When I rejoined the guard in the hallway, he walked me to the elevator. The ride down was suffused with an uncomfortable quiet. I was sure he was thinking I'd had a bout of paranoia, or maybe some sort of stress-induced episode. Part of me even started to doubt my own. Recollections, could exhaustion and bad lighting have conjured such vivid sensations? Yet the pounding of my heart and the cold sweat on my body had felt undeniably real. My mouth was still so dry that my lips stuck together when I tried to speak. We reached the lobby and he told me the building log showed no one else inside. At that time, I nodded, thanking him, and stepping out into the cool night air. The breeze washed over me, but it did little to dispel the creeping sense of dread that clung to me. Even as I started my car and drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left part of myself behind in that stale, flickering conference room. For days afterward, I felt this constant tension in my muscles. Whenever I approached the clinic, my nights were punctuated by restless dreams, images of swinging doors, half-seen figures, vanishing into darkness, and the metallic clang of old file drawers echoing in the distance each morning. I questioned if I should even mention this to my colleagues, but I knew most of them would dismiss it as an overactive imagination. The few who might believe me would whisper their own stories of eerie encounters, but always in hushed voices, afraid to be ridiculed. Still, something had shifted in my mind. Tasks that once seemed routine now made me uneasy. I'd find myself glancing around corners, waiting for a sudden flicker of light, or that dreaded sound of metal slamming. Even the hum of the vending machine in the break room sometimes made my chest tighten with involuntary anxiety. The strange heaviness I felt that night in the old archive room lingered, as though the building's past had become an invisible presence. Following me through my daily routine, it might have been the weight of the clinic's history. Decades of records. Stories of countless patient staff changes, expansions, and renovations, all layered upon each other in that old building. Maybe something intangible had seeped into the walls, something you can't just renovate away, or perhaps it was the human mind playing tricks under stress, spinning normal creaks and electric glitches into a tapestry of horror. I can't say for sure. All I know is that the feeling of being watched, of not being entirely alone in that quiet, echoing corridor, has stayed with me every once in a while. I catch a glimpse of the conference room door if I pass by on the second floor. Sometimes I swear I hear a faint squeak of hinges, even when there's no wind, or see the light flicker when no one is inside. I avoid that place now unless absolutely necessary. Even during the daytime, the memory of that heavy air and the sense of something wrong keeps me from lingering. It's not fear of death or the unknown. It's the fear of a silence so intense and a presence so intangible that it challenges the very boundaries of what we accept as real. Some nights when I stay late again for work, I find myself tensing up as dusk settles. The hum of fluorescent light sets my nerves on edge. My throat goes dry and my hands grip the edges of my desk until they turn white. I refuse to use that conference room anymore unless someone else is with me, yet even if I never step foot in there alone, I've learned that certain places cling to their shadows. They do not need you to enter them in order to make their presence felt. And every so often when I allow my guard to slip, I sense that faint metallic clang reverberating in the back of my mind, reminding me that some doors once open never truly close. I never did find a rational explanation for the events of that night. The security guard still nods politely at me, but I can see the trace of uncertainty in his eyes whenever we pass in the hallway. Perhaps he wonders if I was just overly tired, or perhaps he senses that something happened, though he can't bring himself to believe it outright. As for me, I don't need anyone else to confirm my story, that suffocating moment. The flickering lights, the sound of metal drawers banging in the distance, and those doors swinging open on their own, these images are etched permanently into my memory. I walked away that night, but I carried the lingering weight with me. The horror of that experience was not a violent act or a visible apparition. It was the silent, pervasive force of an old place steeped in an unknown history where reality itself seemed to warp, just enough to make me question my senses even now. I sometimes wake from uneasy dreams, my heart pounding as I recall the conference room. I can feel that stale draft on the back of my neck, smell the faint odor of dusty metal, and sense a presence behind me waiting for me to lower my guard again. That's how it ended, with me escaping the building and leaving the tension behind, at least physically. But as for the deeper dread, the feeling that I brushed up against something I couldn't explain that has never truly gone away, maybe never will. And every day I step into that clinic, I realize that whatever lurks in the old archives is biding its time. Whether it's purely psychological or something beyond my comprehension, the sense of an unspoken watcher remains. And for now, that is enough to keep my pulse racing every time I pass that quiet corridor on the second floor. I remember the first time I truly felt the air in my makeshift home office thicken with an inexplicable heaviness. It was well past midnight, and I'd been hunched over my keyboard, staring at data that refused to make sense in my tired mind. The room was too still for my liking, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the computer tower. Without warning, a soft rustling erupted behind my desk like someone tugging on wires. They had no right to touch my heart. Thuddered in my chest, and a cold bead of sweat snaked down my temple. Even before I swiveled my chair to investigate, I sensed something more. Insidious than the usual night noises, it was an unsettling moment. A crack in the veneer of safety I'd always felt in my own home. I had turned this spare room into an office at the height of the pandemic. Remote work demanded a space of my own, so I pushed an old bookshelf against one wall, set up my computer on a sturdy wooden desk, and put up a few motivational posters for Goodman Muir. The rest of the house never gave me much pause. Even on stormy nights here, though, the shadows seemed to cling to the corners like cobwebs, and every flicker of the overhead light struck me as a silent warning. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just anxious from the world's chaos, but the rustling behind my desk persisted. Whenever I worked late, I heard it sometimes soft, sometimes more urgent, like frantic, tiny claws scraping across plastic cables. I initially blamed rodents. It was a simple explanation, determined to solve the problem. I placed bait traps and checked them religiously for days each time the traps remained untouched. No signs of gnawing, no droppings, nothing. I grew more puzzled and more uneasy if there were no pests. Then who or what was causing that sound one night in a surge of frustration? I peered behind the desk with a flashlight. I expected to see a nest or droppings. Instead, I saw nothing but a tangled mass of cables and dust. Moe's drifting in the light beam, yet the sensation of being watched was so potent I felt my scalp prickle. My own breath rasped too loud in my ears, and I had to force myself to pull away from that claustrophobic gap. A few evenings later, something happened that shattered any illusion. Abnormally, the screen flickered while I was in the middle of reviewing some work documents. I blinked thinking it was a computer glitch or a power surge. Then a small text window popped onto the screen, lines of garbled text scrolling by at a frantic pace. Random letters, odd symbols, nonsensical fragments of words. My chest constricted and I felt my pulse hammering in my neck. It looked like a virus at first glance, but my antivirus scan returned. Nothing confused, I sat there, cold dread coating my skin as the bizarre text kept rolling, then vanished abruptly. A second later, the screen went black. I tried to shake off the sense that something had just reached out to me, but I couldn't. From that point on, I couldn't brush aside the disturbing feeling that my office housed more than just me and my electronics. Occasionally, I'd find the monitor on when I was certain I had shuttered off the harsh glow illuminating the dust motes in the air. When I stepped closer, the reflection on the screen would momentarily look unfamiliar. It wasn't a perfect match to my face. There always seemed to be a flicker of movement behind me or a distortion around my silhouette. I started dreading the nights when I had to work late, or even just the times I had to enter that room. After dark, the overhead light, which was always a bit dim now, felt wholly inadequate. Leaving corners in thick shadow, my attempts to confide in a friend over the phone were met with sympathetic chuckles. He suggested I was stressed from isolation and too much screen time, urging me to take a break. According to him, everything I described had a rational explanation. I could almost hear the shrug in his voice. He recommended routine maintenance on my computer and maybe a professional inspection to confirm there were no pests or wiring issues. It was all perfectly logical, but as the days turned into weeks, the notion of logic itself felt slippery. The tension in the room suffocated me with every passing hour I spent in that confined space. Little details gnawed at the edges of my mind at times. I swore I heard faint whispering, not words, exactly more like a rasp of breath or static from an old radio. The hair on my arms would stand on end and a cold sweat would break out on the back of my neck each time I'd move to investigate the sound dissolved into silence. My body reacted even before my mind could process it, leaving me shaky and swallowing hard. Struggling to keep a semblance of composure, I started double-checking the door, ensuring it was locked, as though I needed to protect the rest of the house from what lurked in that office. My paranoia crept up on me in waves. I'd catch myself staring at the blank computer screen, half expecting another wave of random text. Nothing would happen, but then late at night, just when I felt on the verge of sleep, a short, sharp beep from the monitor or a sudden flash of light would jerk me to full alertness. My heart pounded so violently that I thought it might burst. My palms slicked with sweat, and sometimes my vision blurred from the intensity of it. Each incident passed with no visible culprit, yet the sense of a presence unseen but tangibly there grew stronger one evening. After a particularly stressful day, I decided to run every possible diagnostic I could think of. The computer was functioning normally, no corrupted files, no malicious software cables were properly connected, power supply stable. I could find no explanation for the flickers and text windows. By then the fears settled in my gut like a coiled snake as I shut everything down for the night. The soft rustling behind the desk returned louder this time, like something scraping across the floor. My hand shook as I fumbled for the flashlight. Once again, no trace of any creature. The emptiness felt mocking. Eventually, I started wondering if my own mental state was to blame. Could isolation and stress conjure hallucinations? I read about sleep deprivation, paranoid delusions, even poltergeist phenomena triggered by emotional turmoil. Nothing fit perfectly. The phenomena were too irregular to be pinned to a single cause. I found myself experiencing fleeting episodes of lightheadedness. Whenever I lingered near the desk too long, my mind kept wandering to that flickering reflection in the monitor, that intangible movement right at the edges of my peripheral vision in the back of my head. A constant refrain looped. Something was in that room and I had invited it by setting up camp there. The culminating moment of terror happened a few nights ago. I was trying to finalize a report long past midnight. A sickly yellow light from a small lamp cast elongated shadows on the walls. My eyes burned from strain and I could feel that gritty ache in my temples. The office was stiflingly quiet, so when a sudden hiss of static popped on my monitor, my breath caught painfully in my throat. The screen glowed a dim gray and a single line of text appeared. It looked almost like an address or a phrase, but it was jumbled with bizarre characters. My pulse thundered in my ears and I felt my teeth clench involuntarily as I stared. The text shifted, rearranging itself in real time. I could almost make out words in English, but they were incomplete, broken segments that made no sense. My vision swam, adrenaline coursing through me. I had the distinct feeling that if I deciphered it, something irreversible would happen. A wave of vertigo made me grip the desk for support, my fingernails biting into the wood. The screen then flickered once more and went black in the reflection of that dead monitor. I glimpsed a shape behind me, tall, slender, with angles that didn't align with a human figure. My stomach lurched. I spun around, nearly knocking over my chair. No one was there. That was the final straw. I gathered my nerve and stormed out of the room. My heart pounded so hard it hurt, and my lungs felt squeezed. Each breath ragged and shallow. I could barely sleep that night when I did doze off. I dreamed of twisting cables and that faceless reflection looming behind me by morning. My hands were still unsteady. Rational thought told me I could just move my computer back to the living room or another part of the house, but a twisted part of me worried it would follow me. That this thing was no longer confined to one room, I decided to confront it, or at least confront my own fear. I stepped into the office the following evening at dusk, flipping on every light available. I approached the computer, carefully touching the power button. The whirring fans and gentle glow reassured me for a moment, but then the screen flickered again twice. My muscles tensed and my mouth went dry. I forced myself to remain rooted to the spot. Focusing on the faint crackling in the air around me, it felt charged, as though an electric current was dancing inches from my skin. My gut twisted in dread, yet I refused to run. Nothing appeared this time. The monitor stayed normal and the rustling sound behind the desk never came. Instead, the silence pressed in so heavily it made my ears ring. My heart hammered and I could taste bile at the back of my throat, but I stayed put, determined to maintain control. I don't know how long I stood there trembling, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, the tension became unbearable and I slumped into my chair, my whole body shaking. There was a subtle shift in the air, like a breeze passing through a sealed room. Then for just a split second, the overhead light dimmed when it returned to full brightness. I had the uncanny sensation that I was alone again. I still use that office, but I do so cautiously. The incidents haven't stopped completely, although they occur less frequently. Sometimes I catch sight of texts that dissolve into random code before my eyes. Other times I swear I see a second reflection in the computer screen, a glimmer of a shape that should not exist yet. I've managed to carry on with work, telling myself it's just my imagination. Every so often the hair on my neck stands up when the monitor flickers in the corner of my vision. My heart quickens and I break into a cold sweat, bracing for whatever might come next. I haven't found a logical explanation, and perhaps I never will. All I know is that something in that room is not entirely human, or not human at all. It clings to the cables, flickers across the screen, and waits in the gloom for a moment of weakness. My best guess is that it feeds on attention or fear, finding cracks in the barrier between the digital and the real. I might be wrong, but that suspicion is the only thing that makes sense. After all I've witnessed, some nights I imagine that the shadows behind me stretch out in new shapes, as though the entity is on the brink of fully manifesting. I've learned to keep my guard up, to check the corners of the room before I settle down to work. The sense of peril never truly fades. It ebbs and flows with the hum of my computer fans, with the flicker of lights, with the claustrophobic silence that descends after midnight. Even when I leave the office, I sometimes feel its echo following me, my skin prickling as if unseen eyes are locked on my back. I don't know if there's a way to banish it, or if there's even anything tangible to banish at times. I suspect it's a projection of my own isolation, a product of the collective unease that the pandemic brought into our lives. Yet in the quieter hours when I sense the cable shifting and see those cryptic messages flash across the screen, doubt drills into my brain like a malevolent whisper. I remain vigilant, constantly on edge. My hands still tremble whenever I push that power button at dusk. Sometimes I think about ripping everything out, every cable, every device, and moving on from this place. But I can't deny a dark curiosity, a compulsion to uncover the nature of the thing that lurks in the glow of my screen. As I write this, I feel it behind me, a subtle vibration in the air, an inaudible presence that charges the room with silent intent. My skin is clammy, my heart and my throat, but I keep typing. Compelled to share this account in the hope that acknowledgement might weaken its hold when I'm finished, I'll shut down the monitor and leave the room. Whether I'm truly safe or not, I can't say. All I know is that once I close the door, I'll still be thinking about the gentle scrape of cables behind the desk and the face or whatever it is that sometimes stares back at me in the dark reflection of my screen. I knew something was wrong the moment I first set foot in that attic. It wasn't the sunlight streaming through the high windows during the day on the surface. The space looked appealing enough with vaulted ceilings and polished floorboards. Yet from the instant I walked inside, I felt an oppressive weight lingering in the corners. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath quietly, waiting for darkness to descend so they could whisper their secrets without interruption. I had moved into the suburban house just a few weeks earlier. The landlord had converted the attic into a spacious studio, and the rent was surprisingly affordable. At first, I tried to ignore my apprehension. I told myself it was only natural to feel uneasy in a new place, especially one with so many hidden nooks and beams overhead. But the discomfort grew stronger each time I opened the attic door. During the day, the wide windows let in ample light, casting long shapes on the floor that changed angles as the sun rose and fell. Everything seemed normal enough when I watched dust particles floating lazily in the beams of sunlight if I didn't look. Too closely, I could almost believe I was imagining the faint tension that hovered in the air. Almost it was at night that things changed. The first evening I stayed up late, I found myself listening to the house's every noise downstairs. I could pick out the hum of the refrigerator in the shared kitchen and the muted creaks of the floorboards whenever someone else passed by on their way to bed. But up here in my attic room, the sounds took on a different, sharper quality. The wooden rafters let out soft groans that seemed louder than they had been during the day. More than once, I froze mid-sentence while reading a report or sorting through my paperwork, convinced I heard what might be footsteps directly above my head, but that made no sense. The attic ceiling was the roof itself. There was no higher floor for anyone to walk. On the rational part of my mind insisted it was nothing but the wooden structure settling at night. Houses made noise. It was part of living in an older building still. Every time the creaking started, my pulse sped up. I tried to shake off the anxious feeling, focusing on my work. Instead, there was a project I needed to finish, and staying up late was my only option. The overhead light, though, bright, suddenly felt stark and artificial as I studied my notes. The warmth that sunlight provided during the day was absent. Now my eyes darted around the room, picking up small shadows that seemed to grow taller. With every hour that passed, the single lamp on the desk cast my own outline onto the nearest wall, and I couldn't help noticing how my silhouette sometimes looked like it was trembling. Even when I thought I was perfectly still one night while sifting through a stack of printed documents, I heard a low, indistinct murmur right next to my shoulder. The sound was so soft that for a second I assumed it was just the rustling of paper, yet the noise persisted. It had a hushed, breathy quality that made my skin crawl. I stood up so fast that my chair toppled over. Clattering against the wooden floor, my heart hammered in my chest, and I had to place a hand on the desk to steady myself. Slowly, I turned to look, half expecting to find someone standing behind me, but there was no one there. I told myself it was my imagination, a result of stress or lack of sleep. Still, I couldn't shake the impression that something had been inches away from my ear, whispering just below the threshold of comprehension. My palms were slick with sweat, and my breathing felt uneven. Even the hair on my arm stood on end. I stayed awake for hours afterward, pacing the attic and trying to gather the courage to look into every corner to see if there was some logical explanation, a vent or a gap in the insulation that might create those eerie sounds. But no matter how thoroughly I searched, I found nothing out of place. I began to notice other small oddities around the attic. Some evenings I'd be convinced I left my notebook on the desk only to discover it. Later on the bed, my laptop, which I usually kept plugged in on a small table near the window, sometimes ended up on the floor as if someone had gently placed it there. At first I assumed I was just being absent-minded, perhaps. In my exhaustion, I was moving things around without realizing it. But there came a point where these movements seemed too deliberate to be accidental. My paranoia flared whenever I glimpsed a shift in the arrangement of items on my bookshelf or a pen that seemed to vanish for hours before turning up in a drawer. I rarely used, the changes were subtle but undeniable. The effect on my nerves was profound. Even during daylight, the attic felt heavier, more claustrophobic. I found myself scanning the sloped ceiling whenever I entered, half expecting to see a face peering down at me from the beams. Sometimes I would catch a motion in my peripheral vision, a flicker of movement that disappeared the moment I turned my head. My neck and shoulders grew perpetually tense, as though I were bracing for an attack from the shadows. Every new creak sent a spike of adrenaline coursing through my veins. My mouth would go dry and I'd have to swallow repeatedly just to keep from coughing. I tried explaining some of my concerns to the landlord in an indirect way. I mentioned the noises at night, wondering if perhaps there were raccoons or squirrels trapped in the crawl space. The landlord expressed mild surprise and claimed never to have heard anything like that. He offered to do a quick inspection, but never found any evidence of animals. His reassurance should have calmed me, but it only made me more uneasy. If there weren't rodents scurrying around up there, then what else could it be? By the second week, my sleep became restless. Even if I went to bed at a reasonable hour, I would jolt awake multiple times during the night. Certain I heard faint thumping above me. My heart pounded whenever I realized I had kicked off my blankets at some point, leaving me feeling exposed more than once. I woke with the sensation that someone was leaning over me, their breath cold against my cheek. In those terrifying moments, I would keep my eyes firmly shut too, afraid of what I might see if I opened them. The darkness pressed in on me and the quiet of the attic felt unnatural, as though it was a silence enforced by something unseen. My work started to suffer. I couldn't concentrate. Every little detail in the attic demanded my attention. A slight shift in the shadows, the subtle scraping noise, the old radiator made the rustle of wind outside the window that set the roof shingles trembling. I found my hands shaking as I typed. Forcing myself to slow down and breathe coffee became my crutch. Though it did little to settle my nerves, I tried telling friends about it, though. Never in a direct, detailed way. I simply mentioned feeling odd. Vibes in the new place. Their advice was typical. Get more sleep play, some music to lighten the mood, maybe burn scented candles. I tried it all, but the underlying sense of dread remained little by little. I stopped inviting people over the idea of having someone else in that attic with me felt wrong, as if I might somehow drag them into the presence lurking there. I caught myself double-checking the locks on the attic door and the small closet at the far end of the room. Nothing was amiss yet. I couldn't shake the conviction that I was not alone. Sometimes I'd sense a faint pressure in the air, as though an invisible figure was standing. Too close, invading my personal space, my skin would break out in goosebumps and a chill would run down my spine. Even if the temperature was mild on a particularly stormy night, I experienced the worst incident, yet rain lashed against the attic windows and thunder rumbled in the distance. The overhead lights flickered occasionally but didn't go out. I tried to focus on my tasks, determined to finish some critical paperwork for a looming deadline. Outside, lightning illuminated the suburb in brief flashes, creating warped shadows that danced across my floor. Around midnight, I felt the same drop in the air pressure I had noticed before, the sense that something was moving around me just beyond my field of vision. My heart rate spiked and I reached for my phone, thinking I might turn on some quiet music to distract myself before I could unlock the screen. I heard the faint shuffle of feet on the attic floorboards. It didn't sound like the usual creaking of old wood. This was more deliberate, like bare footsteps walking toward me from the far side of the room. My breath caught in my throat. I kept telling myself that no one else was there, that it had to be a trick of the wind or my overworked imagination. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to stop right behind my chair for a moment. The only sound was the storm outside. Then I felt a cold brush of air across the back of my neck, as though an icy fingertip had traced a line along my skin. My entire body tensed, and I nearly dropped my phone. Every hair stood on end, and my muscles locked in panic. Summoning what little courage I had left, I turned around. There was no one there, but the overhead light flickered again, and for the briefest instant my reflection in the window seemed distorted, as if a second figure stood at my side, vanishing. The moment the lightning faded, my chest, con restricted, and I was flooded with a powerful urge to run. I fumbled around trying to gather my essentials, a backpack, keys, laptop, before rushing to the attic door. My hands trembled so badly that it took me 3 tries to open the latch. I raced down the narrow stairs, nearly stumbling in my haste. My breath ragged and shallow, I spent the rest of that night in my car, parked a few blocks away, heart still hammering in my chest. Rain pelted the windshield, and the occasional flash of lightning revealed my pale, haunted face in the rearview mirror. In the cramped safety of that space, I tried to collect my thoughts. I told myself I would find another place to live immediately, no matter the financial cost, a motel, a friend's couch, anything but that attic. The memory of those footsteps, that presence, refused to leave me. My skin still tingled in the spot where I thought I'd felt. The icy touch sleep was out of the question. The next morning, I managed to work up enough nerve to return. The hallway below the attic appeared exactly the same unremarkable paint, the faint smell of coffee coming from the kitchen, and typical morning light streaming through the windows. But as soon as I placed a foot on the attic stairs, a wave of dread swept over me again. Stepping into the room, I found everything precisely where I had left it. My scattered papers, the toppled chair I hadn't bothered to pick up in my haste. Everything looked untouched, yet the atmosphere felt heavier, like a vacuum that had been waiting for my return to fill it. It was as though the attic had its own pulse thrumming at the edge of hearing, eager to reignite my terror. Gathering the last of my belongings, I tried not to linger. My mind raced. Cycling through rationalizations, maybe it was all psychological stress, amplified by the attic's creaks and groans, culminating in a heightened state of paranoia. Yet, no matter how many times I repeated that mantra, a deeper, more primal part of me insisted that something was actually there, occupying that space, feeding on my distress. My gut twisted with nausea at the thought of having spent even a single night beneath that roof. I never confronted the landlord about it directly. I moved out by the end of that week. Cutting the rental agreement short, the landlord didn't protest much. Maybe my pallor or shaky demeanor suggested I was on the verge of a breakdown when I loaded my last box into my car. I caught myself looking up at the attic window one final time. For a second, I thought I saw the faint outline of a silhouette in the glass, but I refused to do a double take. My chest felt tight, my mouth completely dry. My only goal was to turn that corner and leave the house behind me forever. Now that I've settled to a different place across town, I find it hard to talk about that attic without my voice wavering. I lie in bed, sometimes replaying those nights in my head, questioning whether the presence was supernatural or if I was simply unraveling. Under pressure, the new apartment is modern with solid walls and bright lighting, yet I can't fully relax. Late at night, a tiny part of me braces for a creak, a whisper, or the sensation of cold breath on the back of my neck. My rational mind insists I'm safe. Now that whatever lurked in the attic did not follow me, but in moments of weakness, I catch myself listening for footsteps in the empty hall outside. Sometimes I feel that same pressure in the air, that sense of being watched every once in a while. I think I glimpse a shape in the corner of my eye, only to find nothing when I turn to look. I still dream about the attic. I see the beams overhead, the pale winter light streaming through those high windows, and hear the relentless creaking of wood. Even in my sleep, the tension builds until I can hardly breathe. I wake drenched in sweat, my heartbeat pounding like a drum in my ears. Whenever that happens, I force myself to walk around my new apartment, reminding myself of the solid floors, the fresh paint, the comfortable furniture. But no matter how reassuring my new surroundings might be, the memory of that attic and the lingering sense that something malevolent resided there refuses to fade completely. In the end, I got away. I managed to escape those claustrophobic walls, that oppressive presence, and the disorienting reality that caused me so many sleepless nights. Yet I can't claim that I've broken free entirely. Whatever happened in that attic, whether it was a trick of my mind or something unexplainable, left a mark. I carry it with me, an undercurrent of dread that stirs whenever I'm alone in a quiet space for too long. It's an unsettling reminder that sometimes the rooms we inhabit hold more than just our belongings. They can hold shadows of the unknown, waiting for the darkness to give them voice, and I can't help but wonder whenever I pass by a house with an attic window, what might be lurking inside, waiting for the next unsuspecting tenant to settle in under those old creaking beams. I still remember the way the bare bulbs in the hallway flickered that evening. It was a sight so ordinary yet so charged with a strange electricity that it made every hair on the back of my neck stand straight. The wooden floor creaked in the silence as though the house itself were trying to speak. In that moment, I felt sure that if I breathed too loudly, something just out of sight might answer. I moved into this old off-campus residence at the start of a new semester, determined to return to university and finally finish my degree. The building, a creaking relic from some forgotten era, had rent cheap enough to fit my modest budget. My housemates, most of them younger than me, were scattered across the other rooms, which branched off a central living area, but down a particularly long corridor set a single isolated bedroom, a place we mostly used for storing extra books and supplies. It was there that I felt the walls closing in, the lights dimming and the air trembling whenever I passed. From the first day, I sensed something was off. It was nothing dramatic at the start. A small discomfort I brushed aside as a trick of my overactive imagination. I told myself it was probably just the chill of an ancient building, the boards bending with the slightest shift in temperature. Nevertheless, every time I walked through that core, I could swear I felt another presence pacing beside me. Footsteps matching my own, but never revealing themselves. I tried to explain it away as echoes of my own steps. Yet the sensation persisted, crawling into my thoughts late at night in the afternoon light. The corridor never seemed that eerie, just a stretch of scratched floorboards and cracked plaster walls, leading to a half-open door at the end, but as dusk settled, the shadows took on a weight. The overhead bulb, dim and perpetually buzzing, created harsh angles across the walls. Occasionally it would flicker, plunging the hall into near darkness before sputtering back to life. More than once I found myself watching those walls, half expecting something to burst out one evening after a long day of classes. I decided to make coffee in the cramped shared kitchen. My plan was to brew a small pot, gather a few reference books from the storage room at the end of the corridor, and work on a research paper. I remember standing by the ancient coffee maker, listening to it gurgle as it struggled to spit out the last drops. My brain was already drifting to the assignment waiting for me, so I almost missed the noise that came from down the hall. At first it was just a faint tapping like nails on wood. Then it changed into steady, deliberate footsteps going back and forth. My heart lurched. Something about that rhythm was off, too purposeful for old pipes or Random House. Settling the footsteps, paused, resumed. Paused again, I set my coffee mug on the counter with a trembling hand and walked slowly toward the corridor with each step. My pulse hammered, a cold sweat trickling down my back. The corridor stretched out before me, silent and empty. The overhead light glowed, flickering just enough to catch my attention. When I reached the doorway, the sense of being watched crept over me again, so powerful that I clenched my fist to keep from trembling, but there was nothing there. I did my best to shake it off. Returning to the kitchen, I found my coffee had gone lukewarm. I stared into the dark liquid. Imagining shadows writhing on its surface, I didn't say anything to anyone that night, convincing myself it might just be nerves or the stress of going back to school. But the feeling of unease lingered, knotting my stomach and making my skin clammy. It got worse over the next few days. Each time I walked down that corridor, I felt a subtle shift in the air as though some silent watcher was crouched in the corners. Where the light refused to reach occasionally, the sense of another set of footsteps became so strong that I found myself stopping in my tracks to listen, heart pounding like a drum in my ears. The atmosphere pressed in on me, making my breathing shallow. I taste metallic nervousness on my tongue, my throat almost too tight to swallow. One afternoon, after mustering enough courage, I confided in one of my housemates. I mentioned the footsteps, how they seemed to echo my own. He chuckled, told me it was just the ancient plumbing and the squeaky floors. He insisted he had heard random thuds all the time with a dismissive wave of his hand. He reassured me it was nothing to lose sleep. Over his lack of concern made me second-guess my own experiences. Perhaps I really was making too much of the situation still at night. The corridor changed into something else entirely. Those old walls had witnessed who knows how many decades of secrets, and they seemed to whisper them to me whenever I dared pass. The floorboards groaned as I took careful steps. The light flickered, and occasionally I detect a faint smell of damp earth. My breaths grew shallow, my heart pounding against my ribcage twice. I thought I saw a shape down at the far end near the storage room, a figure that dissolved the instant I tried to focus on it. One night, determined not to be intimidated by my own imagination, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I told myself I was going to walk the corridor late alone and visit that isolated room for the books I needed, without letting my nerves get the better of me around midnight. I stood at the threshold, a single bulb glowed overhead. Giving the space of sickly yellow tint, every muscle in my body felt coiled, ready to spring. I began walking slowly, feeling my throat tighten with each step. The air was thick, weighing down on me like a damp blanket. Halfway down, I sensed it again, footsteps faint but inescapable. Mirroring my pace, my chest constricted. My breath shallow, I could practically feel my heartbeat in my ears, a staccato of panic. It felt as though something intangible was creeping alongside me, matching me. Stride for stride, I forced myself to keep going. When I reached the door to the storage room, I fumbled for the light switch. My fingers shook, slipping on the old metal plate. I finally managed to flick it on, revealing dusty boxes, stacks of books, and random supplies. The tang of old paper and stale air filled my nostrils. I stood there, letting my eyes roam across the clutter. Nothing moved, yet the silence was too absolute, as if the space itself was holding its breath. A single overhead bulb illuminated cobwebs dangling in the corners, their shadows swaying across the walls. Just as I tried to convince myself everything was normal, I heard a creak behind me. My stomach lurched, whirling around. I saw no one, just the empty corridor, but the distinct sensation of being observed made every inch of my skin prickle in that moment. Felt disoriented, questioning my own senses. Was I losing my grip on reality? Or was there truly something lurking here, hidden just beyond my line of sight? I gathered the books I needed with unsteady hands, hugging them to my chest. As I inched backward into the corridor, the hallway light flickered again. Intensifying my anxiety, I forced myself to walk back toward the main living area. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was trudging through thick mud. By the time I reached my bedroom, my pulse was racing and I was covered in a cold sweat. I couldn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay in bed, my mind stuck on the echo of those footsteps. My breath came in, shallow sips, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the corridor stretching out infinitely, the light bulb swinging overhead, the shadows lengthening into menacing shapes. I tried burying my face in the pillow to block out my thoughts, but it was useless. I was exhausted by morning, yet the fear didn't loosen its grip on me. Days slipped into nights, and I felt the tension growing. My classes became an afterthought as I found it nearly impossible to concentrate. I began dreading returning home. Even though the corridor was just a short stretch of hallway, it felt like miles. Sometimes I'd linger in the living room waiting for someone else to walk with me so I wouldn't be alone on those rare occasions. I'd sense no presence, no echoing steps, but the moment I had to face it by myself, late at night with the others asleep or out the corridor, became suffocating. I tried telling another housemate about my experiences, describing the footsteps and how they seemed to keep pace with me. He only shrugged and suggested it might be stress or some old vent, whistling in the walls. Some nights I thought I could hear a faint whispering, a hushed rustle of voices behind the plaster. Other times I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I snapped my head around, all I saw were the dim corners of the corridor and the chipped paint on the walls. My paranoia grew. I developed an unshakable sense that something was feeding off my fear. Relishing each shaky breath I took, my mouth would go dry whenever I approached that door. At the end of the hall, my heart drumming so loudly I worried it would burst. I started questioning my own sanity, wondering if I was somehow projecting all my anxieties about returning to school onto this old house. Then came the night when everything reached a breaking point. I was in the living room struggling to focus on my notes. The wind outside was howling, rattling the windows, an uneasy feeling. Twisted in my gut, and I found myself unable to resist glancing toward the corridor. It looked darker than usual, the light at the far end flickering in and out as though someone were tampering with the switch. My pulse sped up. I tried to ignore it, told myself I was being paranoid, but the thought persisted. Eventually, I sat down my notebook and tiptoed to the entrance of the corridor. The overhead bulb flickered again, casting jerky shadows along the walls. As I stepped forward, my legs felt weak and a thin bead of sweat trailed down my temple. The echoing footsteps started up almost immediately. They weren't overly loud, but they carried a steady, insistent rhythm that set my nerves aflame. My breath caught in my throat. I kept going, refusing to give in to the dread. Halfway down, the footsteps stopped instead of relief. I felt a wave of nausea. The silence pressed in on me, and I picked up on a faint scratching sound behind the plaster. It reminded me of nails scraping wood, but the pattern was too deliberate. My heart pounded so hard I worried the sound might echo through the corridor. I took another step, then just beyond the door to the storage room. The light flickered off entirely, plunging the far end into complete darkness. I froze. My skin prickled and my breathing became erratic. It felt as if the darkness was sentient, a presence that stared back at me. I forced my hand up toward the light switch on the corridor wall, my fingers shaking uncontrollably, flicking. It produced a dull click, but the bulb refused to come back on another step forward, and I heard a sudden rush of movement like something scuttling away at inhuman speed. Cold terror shot up my spine. I stepped back. Wanting nothing more than to run, but some twisted sense of resolve made me grit my teeth. I refused to allow this invisible thing, be it a manifestation of my own terror or something else, to drive me out of my own living space. With a trembling hand, I dug my phone out of my pocket, switched on the flashlight, and aimed it down the corridor in that harsh white beam. The old walls looked more decayed than ever, paint peeling away like dead skin. The door to the storage room stood ajar, barely illuminated. I took a hesitant step, then another when I reached the doorway. My breath hitched in my throat the entire room. Beyond seemed coated in deeper shadow, as if the darkness were thicker there, clinging to every surface. My phone's flashlight caught dust, most not swirling in the still air, but nothing else. I stood at the threshold, my heart thawing in my chest, sweat dripping down my temples and neck. The smell of damp paper filled my nostrils. I forced myself to look around. Shining the light over every corner, boxes, a pile of chairs, a tall bookshelf jammed with old textbooks. Nothing appeared out of place, yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, so powerful that I could hardly draw breath. It felt like something was within arm's reach. If only I could see past the darkness. A sudden breeze from the corridor behind me rustled the pages of an open book on a nearby box. I jerked around, phone lights swinging wildly. My vision blurred with the motion, and in that fraction of a second, I swore. I saw a shape, a distorted silhouette that vanished the instant my light fell on it. My heart kicked into overdrive, my throat closing up. That was all I could handle in that moment. I made the choice to confront it or get out my rational mind. told me that staying there alone in the dark was madness. So I mustered the last bit of courage. I had shouted that I wasn't afraid. Though my trembling voice betrayed me and backed away, I kept the flashlight trained on the doorway until I reached the lit part of the corridor when I finally turned to run. My legs felt like lead, my lungs burning. With every ragged breath, I spent the remainder of the night awake in my own room, phone and hand lights glaring overhead. Sleep never came. My mind churned with thoughts of that shape I might have seen. I still couldn't decide if it was real or just a product of my anxiety. By the time the first light of morning seeped through my window, I was resolved I had to reclaim my peace of mind one way or another. In the following days, I looked into other housing options, determined to leave that place behind. Yet I couldn't shake the sense that I'd be running from my own fears. If I simply moved out on my last night in that house, I deliberately avoided the corridor, refusing to retrieve anything from the storage room. I bunkered down in my bedroom, trying to calm my nerves by reminding myself that I was the one in control of my life. But the flicker of the hallway light under my door and the faint creaks in the floorboards told me it was still there. Whatever it was, waiting watching early the next morning, I packed my bags and without a backward glance, I left that residence. Even as I crossed the threshold, I sensed the weight of the corridor pressing on me, urging me to hurry. When the door clicked shut behind me, my chest loosened and I could finally breathe freely. Even now, far away from that old house, I sometimes imagine I hear footsteps trailing me late at night when the wind in my new apartment creaks through the vents. I feel my pulse quicken my skin, prickling with sweat. The memory of that corridor, the flickering lights, the echoing steps, the oppressive sensation of being constantly observed remains etched in my mind. And though I've done everything in my power to move on, there's always a small voice in the back of my head that wonders if I truly escaped, or if a part of that presence followed me sometimes. In the dark, I'm certain I feel it there, pacing just behind my every step. A low buzz of fluorescent light greeted me when I first entered the building that night, but the glow it cast felt thin, as if any second it might flicker out and leave me stranded in darkness. The ancient walls seemed to press in around me, their faded paint peeling like dead skin. With every step, the wooden floor groaned beneath my shoes, creating a rhythmic chorus of muffled creaks that set my teeth on edge. I sensed something almost predatory in the silence. Beyond those lights, like a presence lurking just out of sight right from the beginning. My nerves hummed with an unexplainable tension, as though I had stumbled into a place that didn't quite follow the normal rules of reality. I work in a commercial building in the heart of downtown, a structure that has clearly seen better days. The city may have a reputation for constant activity, but once the sun sets, the building empties, swiftly leaving only a handful of unlucky souls to burn the midnight oil. Tonight, I found myself among them. My office is down a narrow corridor on the 6th floor, a corridor that has always felt a bit off. It's poorly lit with only a couple of weak overhead bulbs. The floor is made of old hardwood, its boards loose and perpetually creaking. As though they're straining underfoot, the walls are painted a tired shade of beige, and the air never seems to fully circulate even on windy nights. It's the kind of place you want to rush through rather than linger in. I stayed late to finish revising some reports that had landed on my desk at the last minute. Deadlines loomed, and the promise of a quiet, empty office after hours seemed like an advantage at first around 9 p.m. I felt a twinge of unease, though there was no logical reason for it still. I forced myself to refocus on the stack of documents. Each page seemed heavier than usual, and the soft drone of the nearby ventilation system was the only real sound accompanying my tired thoughts. At some point, I needed to print out several of the revised pages. My small printer in the office wasn't working properly, so I had to rely on the communal one located by the elevators, a good distance down that eerie corridor before leaving my office. I distinctly remember switching on the overhead lights in the hall. I recall the fluorescent hum kicking in, illuminating the worn-out floor in an anemic glow. Yet no sooner had I picked up my papers and stepped outside than I found myself in near total darkness. The lights were off, and I couldn't understand how it happened so quickly. A spike of cold apprehension shot through me. I switched them on again. feeling a draft of chilly air that made the tiny hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The corridor, suddenly illuminated, looked even more desolate under the flickering fluorescent. I shrugged it off, assuming an electrical. The building was old after all, and outages or flickering lights weren't uncommon. Still, I couldn't completely shake the unsettling feeling that the darkness had been waiting there, ready to swallow me. The moment I let my guard down when I reached the printer, I heard the gentle whir as it spat out my pages. I noticed no one else was around. No hum of conversation, no footsteps, nothing. The deserted hallway added to a growing sense of isolation. The only sounds were mechanical, the rhythmic clicks of the printer, the occasional groan from the old pipes, and my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. My mouth had gone dry and my palms felt clammy. As I gathered the documents returning to my office, I froze in the doorway upon noticing the corridor lights were off again. I was positive I had left them on just moments ago, trying to remain composed. I reached for the switch, bracing for the unexpected cold breeze that once again wafted over for me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my temple. It didn't make any sense. Light switches don't flip themselves, and nobody else was working. This late, at least not on this floor. Despite the pounding in my chest, I scolded myself mentally for being so jumpy. I tried to chalk it up to the building's notorious wiring issues, but that explanation felt flimsy. My resolve to finish the reports remained, though. So I returned to my desk, turned on the overhead lamp, and busied myself with reading through the final pages. Time slipped by as I became engrossed in the details of each line, but a subtle awareness of the silent corridor beyond my door never left me. Occasionally, I would sense a rush of cold air filtering under the door, yet curiously, the moment I opened it to investigate the air in the corridor felt thick and stagnant, almost suffocating in its stillness around 10:15 p.m. I needed another set of printed documents. Gathering the new files, I stood up my legs. A bit shaky, my nerves were wearing thin as though I was a violin string about to snap. I stepped into the corridor and was met by darkness. Yet again, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Something was deliberately turning off those lights. It wasn't just a malfunction, the switch was physically returning to the off position, although no one was there. My breath came in quick bursts and my chest felt tight. The air had that dank claustrophobic quality, as if the walls were shrinking around me. I remember pausing in front of the switch, listening intently. I heard the faintest clicking sound to my left, almost like a nail tapping against the wooden boards. I spun my head around but saw only shadows. My pulse raced and I flicked the lights on with a shaky hand. The corridor lit up halfway before one of the bulbs flickered and died, leaving me with partial illumination that served only to make the shadows appear longer and more distorted. I made my way to the printer station, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Every step seemed to amplify the wood. Complaining loudly beneath me, I felt utterly exposed, as though something unseen was studying me. From a vantage point in the darkness, my heart drummed in my ears, and the tension in my shoulders was becoming unbearable. At last, I reached the printer and collected my documents as quickly as possible. Just when I was about to head back, a distinct clicking reached my ears like fingers drumming. Softly on metal, it was close, maybe just around the corner by the elevator doors. My throat tightened and I broke out in a cold sweat. A coworker might have startled me intentionally, but no one had spoken to me about working late. I considered calling out, but fear sealed my lips. Instead, I took a few slow steps toward the elevator, urging my heartbeat to calm when I peered around the corner. The metal elevator doors gleamed, dully entirely still. The corridor beyond was dark. There was no movement, no sign of anyone yet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had receded into the shadows just a second before my gaze landed there. Deciding I wasn't about to solve any mysteries that night, I hurried back to my office again. The corridor lights were off when I arrived at my door. This time I heard the abrupt click of the switch being flicked. The tension in my chest constricted like a vice. My breath hissed between my teeth as I turned, half expecting to catch a silhouette in the ACT. There was nothing, only the hiss of the overhead fixture trying to stabilize. I stepped inside, locked the door, and slumped into my chair, struggling to steady my breathing. Minutes passed, and I managed to regain a fraction of my composure. Still, I couldn't banish the creeping paranoia that something was out there even with my door locked. I felt vulnerable. The slightest noise, a distant creak, a muffled pop of old wood would jolt me. My gut told me I was being watched, that something was just outside my door waiting. I tried to rationalize my fear. Maybe a security guard was toggling the lights, or perhaps the building's archaic wiring was on the fritz. But these explanations felt hollow, especially when the temperature dropped again. A wave of frigid air seemed to seep in through the walls, making my teeth chatter. I kept working, motivated by the desire to finish so I could leave this unnerving place every so often. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to open on its own or reveal some shape pressing against the frosted glass. Pain, the sense of being observed, was almost overwhelming. My muscles trembled with tension, and sweat dampened the collar of my shirt. Despite the cold, if I closed my eyes, I saw flickers of shadows moving just beyond the threshold, though it was impossible to tell if these visions were real or figments of my exhausted mind around 11 p.m. I decided enough was enough. I'd completed most of the urgent tasks, and the rest could wait until morning. I resolved to gather my things and leave. The building's corridors might be empty and unsettling, but the idea of heading home felt like the only sane choice. I shoved my documents into my briefcase, yanked on my jacket, and mustered whatever courage I had left before I unlocked the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Silence except for a faint, almost undetectable scuffling. My heart lurched, but I told myself it was probably just the old pipes again, stepping out into the corridor one last time. I was not surprised to find the lights out, but it still startled me. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood paralyzed for a moment, scanning the darkness. A whisper of cold air brushed past my face, followed by that stifling sensation of no circulation. It felt like I'd walked into a vacuum. My instinct screamed that I shouldn't linger, so I switched the lights on one final time and headed toward the elevator at the far end of the corridor, footsteps echoing in the hush. Halfway there, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, barely noticeable. A shifting in the periphery of my vision. I whipped around there. Near the wall opposite my office door was a faint outline, translucent like a distortion of the air itself. My pulse thundered against my ribcage. It seemed to be shaped like a hunched figure, but it flickered in and out of sight, leaving me uncertain if it was a real form or a trick of the failing lights. The floor's creak drew my eyes downward, and I saw the floorboards pressing and releasing as though unseen feet were treading upon them. I swallowed hard, feeling sweat drip down my temple. My breathing turned shallow, my lungs struggling to take in oxygen. A hot flush of panic surged through my chest. I could almost hear a faint rasping exhale coming from that wavering shape, a sound that made my hair stand on end. Then in a blink it vanished. The corridor looked empty again, but now I was certain I wasn't alone. I bolted for the elevator, heart hammering against my ribs so forcefully I could hardly see straight. The corridor seemed longer than usual, stretching into some impossible distance. My legs felt leaden, but I forced myself to keep moving. Finally, I reached the elevator, jabbing the button repeatedly with trembling fingers. I willed the metal doors to open faster, casting nervous glances over my shoulder. My ears rang with the blood pounding in my head, and the single remaining fluorescent bulb overhead buzzed ominously as if on the verge of dying. When the door slid open, I stepped inside and hit the ground floor button. At that moment, an almost imperceptible rustle echoed from behind me like cloth against the wall. My nerves snapped, my fingers twitched uselessly at the panel before the doors finally closed. I barely had the presence of mind to notice that the elevator was descending faster than normal, an odd worrying behind the paneled walls that I hadn't heard before. As the floor numbers decreased, I tried to steady myself. Leaning against the cold metal, my breath ragged and forced, it felt as if the shadows in the corners of the elevator were thicker than they should be, subtly pulsating in my peripheral vision with a merciful ding. I reached the lobby, the door slid open onto a deserted reception area illuminated by a few emergency lights. I half expected the security guard to ask if I was all right, but the desk was empty. I remembered earlier hearing that the guard occasionally stepped out for rounds in my current state. I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Part of me wanted to talk to someone to confirm I wasn't losing my mind, but the stronger impulse was to leave. Immediately, I hurried past the vacant guard station, out the glass doors, and into the streetlights of the city. Nighttime traffic still moved along. Horns honked in the distance, and a few late-night wanderers strode past. The mundane reality of the outside world contrasted so sharply with the oppressive atmosphere I just escaped that I nearly gasped in relief once I was several yards away from the entrance. I turned to stare up at the old building's dark facade. A single flickering light was visible on the 6th floor, probably right near my office. It made my spine tingle to think about what might still be lurking in that corridor on the walk to my car. I tried to rationalize the events. Could it have been a series of electrical problems, a trick of my overtired mind? Maybe the stress from work had reached a breaking point, manifesting in hallucinations and paranoia. Yet every time I closed my eyes, I recalled the distinct sensation of that cold, stale air pressing in around me, and the memory of that translucent figure shimmering in the half-light, refusing to be dismissed as mere fantasy. My hands still trembled as I fumbled for my car keys driving home. I couldn't shut off the mental images of the lights flicking off on their own, the persistent clicking, and the shape that seemed to lurk just out of direct sight. I replayed the moment I stood in the corridor, certain I heard the switch being flipped behind me. My stomach churned, and I felt later unsure if I was succumbing to some kind of breakdown or if something genuinely unearthly had pursued me in that building. The seatbelt cut into my chest as I breathed, each exhale shaky and uneven. When I finally stepped into my apartment, I locked the door behind me, flicking on every light in sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that some presence had attached itself to me and was waiting outside. A creeping paranoia gnawed at my mind. What if it was already inside, lurking in a dark corner or behind a door? My logical side told me that was impossible, but logical reasoning was no match for the visceral terror that refused to loosen its grip on me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I drifted off, I'd jolt awake at the imagined sound of footsteps or the click of a light switch. My dreams were a chaotic mess of dark corridors stretching infinitely blinking lights and an oppressive cold that crushed the air from my lungs. Morning found me with bloodshot eyes and a throbbing headache, but at least it was morning. The daylight brought a small measure of comfort, dispelling some of the night's terrors. Still, the question of what really happened wouldn't leave me alone. Was it a sign I was overworked, or was I dealing with something that defied logical explanation? A few days have passed, and I haven't set foot in that building after dark. Again, I made excuses to leave by sunset, feigning early appointments or family obligations. Each time I walked past that corridor during the day, I studied the floorboards, listened to the hum of the overhead lights, and scanned the walls for any hint of that presence. There's a tension that never fully releases, as if my subconscious is bracing for that chilling air to sweep over me once more. Yet nothing out of the ordinary happens in the daylight. I sometimes share a watered-down version of my story with a trusted colleague, keeping the details vague. He remarked that many older buildings have their quirks and that others have sensed a strange vibe on the 6th floor, but I avoid telling him about the shape I saw or the feeling that an invisible force was toggling the lights, because I'm not eager to be labeled the office eccentric. Still, deep down, I crave an explanation, some logical, rational reason for those events, or perhaps confirmation that there's a haunted secret in those antiquated hallways. As for me, I'm left with the disquieting realization that I might never unravel the truth. The building remains as it's always been. Old, creaky, and overshadowed by the city's modern skyscrapers, the corridor still stands there on the 6th floor, dimly lit, harboring its unspoken mysteries, and the memory of that night continues to haunt me. An open wound in my consciousness that refuses to fully heal. I've learned to live with the anxiety, though. A part of me fears that one night I'll have no choice but to stay late again, and if that happens, I wonder if I'll encounter the same flickering. Lights the same suffocating air, the same unearthly presence. Even now, recalling the sensations, the rapid heartbeat, the sweat-soaked collar, the overwhelming certainty of being watched makes my pulse quicken. Whether I was on the verge of a breakdown or touched by something beyond comprehension, the final result is the same. I feel changed. A lingering tension ties itself into knots in my stomach whenever the sky darkens. Maybe I escaped physically, but the mental scars remain an ever-present reminder that sometimes it's not the living you need to fear. Sometimes it's the things that shift in the darkness, flicking light switches behind your back, reminding you that you are never as alone or as safe as you think, behold. I still remember the first moment I stepped into that vast antique house. The walls of red brick rose up like the solemn guardians of an era long gone, and the scent of damp wood and dust seemed to breathe history straight. Sank into my lungs, the corridor stretched out into a darkness that swallowed the final hours of daylight, and in that instant a profound disquiet gripped me. Something about the silence felt alive, almost like a watchful presence taking note of my every breath. I had come seeking tranquility, but the atmosphere promised anything but peace. I rented the place with the idea that its isolated location and impressive size would give me the privacy and space I needed to focus on my work as a self-employed individual. I craved an environment free of disruption, somewhere I could think and create. Without interruption, the house stood at the end of a long dirt road with a tall iron gate leading into a courtyard of overgrown grass and a few twisted trees. Nobody else seemed interested in the property. It had been on the market for years, and I remember being surprised that such a large place was so reasonably priced. In my excitement, I overlooked the odd sensation that flickered at the back of my mind. The moment I signed the lease from the outside, the structure was both elegant and imposing, with its tall windows framed by thick shutters. Inside, the ceiling soared, and every footstep echoed in the wide rooms, bouncing off worn parquet floors and tim-stained walls. My first night was uneventful, but I recall having a strange dream in which the corridors stretched endlessly, the doors shifting position like they had a life of their own upon awakening. My heart pounded, and a thin layer of sweat covered my forehead. I assured myself it was just the anxiety of settling into a new place. The feeling of being observed began subtly each morning. As I worked in the study, I felt a prickling on the back of my neck whenever I focused on my computer. Glancing over my shoulder, I never saw anyone there yet. The sensation persisted, an itch just beneath the surface of my awareness. I told myself it was nerves, that maybe the isolation was getting to me. Yet as the days went on, that explained away logic wore thin. It was during the first week that I started noticing distinct sounds echoing through the hall's old houses. Creak, especially those with wooden floors and antique plumbing. So at first I dismissed the noises as the natural settling of the structure, but one particular sound stood out from the rest. The soft drag of footsteps gliding across the floor, not the crisp click of show heels, but something heavier, as though someone were dragging slightly with each step. Every evening around the same time I would hear it. It always seemed to move in the long corridor outside my study. The first few times I jumped up, heart hammering, only to fling open the door and see nothing there. The hallway lights would flicker with a dull hum, and the temperature felt significantly colder. Though the rest of the house stayed at a comfortable warmth, I became paranoid. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself the old pipes might be rattling or the floorboard shifting under changes in humidity. But each night I listened, waiting. The footsteps came without fail, trailing off into silence at the top of the stairs. One evening I worked especially late, hoping that if I were in the study after the usual hour, I might catch sight of whatever was causing that sound, with the desk lamp turned low and only the glow of my screen lighting the room. I waited, my nerves on high alert. I kept glancing at the door, expecting something to move past the frosted glass panel. Then it happened, a faint shift of shadow, as if someone passed by. I felt a prickly wave of cold spread across my skin, and my throat went dry. I leapt up and yanked the door open. The corridor was still the musty air pressed in on me, and my chest felt tight as the week progressed. Even my daytime routine felt plagued by the unshakable sensation that I was not alone. I started double-checking the locks and windows, tested the security system, and walked around the perimeter of the property to see if there were any signs of forced entry. Everything seemed normal, yet the awareness of a presence became increasingly difficult. My concentration frayed, and I found myself pausing mid-sentence or mid-assign, listening for the slightest sound. I confided my unease in a local acquaintance, a caretaker who occasionally looked after the grounds. He only responded that the house was old, and old houses tend to hold on to their histories. There was little comfort in his words, though. He spoke them with a nod and a polite smile. I tried to extract more from him, hoping he might have a story about previous owners or peculiar occurrences, but he did not elaborate afterward. I caught myself analyzing every shift in his expression, convinced he was hiding something. The nights became longer. I developed insomnia, unwilling to sleep early for fear of those footsteps that roamed the corridor. On the rare occasions I did drift off, I found myself jolted awake by the feeling of being touched, like a cool hand brushing against my shoulder. One night, in a half-dream state, I swore I heard labored breathing right by my ear. I shot up, my pulse roaring in my ears, my face slick with sweat. The darkness of the bedroom swallowed the weak moonlight filtering in through the curtains, and in that suffocating silence, my heart hammered so hard that my whole body vibrated with its force. When I turned on the lamp, the bed was empty, the air motionless. I lay there for the rest of the night, too afraid to close my eyes. A few days later, in the early hours of the morning, I decided to go downstairs to grab a glass of water. My nerves were frayed, and my mouth was perpetually dry, as if the tension had sucked the moisture from my body. The entire house seemed to groan around me, the floor protesting each cautious step. I remember descending the staircase, one hand firmly on the banister, noticing how the corridor lights flickered erratically. Halfway down, I caught a glimpse of a silhouette at the far end of the hallway near the kitchen. It was tall and distinct and seemed to fade in and out of my vision. My heart lurched and sweat broke out across my brow again. The silhouette moved. No, it glided into the kitchen. A chill rooted me in place for a moment, but then I pushed forward. The kitchen light was off, so I reached around the door frame to flick it. On the fluorescent bulb sputtered before bathing the room in a harsh white glare. Nobody was there yet. A strange smell lingered in the air, something metallic and stale. I started questioning my own sanity. Perhaps I was overworked, trapped in my own imagination. Maybe stress and isolation were causing hallucinations, yet every time I tried to rationalize, the memory of that shadow in the footsteps grew stronger and more vivid, refusing to be dismissed as mere fantasy. My hands often trembled, and my breathing felt constrained by an invisible tightness in my chest. Even during the day, the knowledge that night would fall again sent a twist of anxiety into my gut. As the second week wore on, my sense of reality began to blur. I would catch glimpses of motion out of the corner of my eye shapes passing by doorways. A reflection in the mirror that vanished when I turned. The house's persistent creaks and groans sounded almost like a voice trying to speak one afternoon. While attempting to focus on my work, the overhead light flickered violently, sending shadows dancing across the room. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure in the reflection of my monitor, gaunt, hunched forward and draped in darkness. I spun around in my chair so fast that I nearly knocked it over, but behind me was only empty space. My heart refused to slow down for what felt like hours. At times, I felt compelled to search the house obsessively. I opened closets, crawled into the attic, and explored the dank basement. I checked under furniture, behind dusty crates, and ran my flashlight over every inch of the walls, looking for hidden doors or compartments. The R part of my mind told me I was being ridiculous. How would such an old place hide a living intruder without leaving any traces? Yet the alternative explanation was even more terrifying. The possibility of something beyond ordinary comprehension stalking the corridors made my skin prickle with cold dread. The draining atmosphere began to affect my health. I struggled to eat, each mouthful tasting like sawdust. My reflection in the bathroom mirror revealed dark circles under my eyes and a tension in my face I barely recognized. Every now and then I would feel a spike of panic for no apparent reason. My chest constricting, my vision narrowing, the sense of being watched grew so intense that I sometimes felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me, making me sweat and tremble. One early evening, after another futile attempt to concentrate on my work, I decided I'd had enough of the uncertainty. I was determined to confront whatever might be lurking in the house. If there was truly something supernatural, I wanted proof, or perhaps I wanted closure, armed with only a flashlight and the courage fueled by desperation. Paced the corridors. Calling out into the darkness, my voice echoed off the walls, and the act of speaking in that silent realm felt strangely sacrilegious. The darkness offered no response, but I sensed an energy shift as though something was aware of my challenge. Moments later, the familiar sound of slow-dragging footsteps reverberated in the hallway behind me. My stomach flipped, and I almost lost the nerve, but I forced myself to spin around, my eyes locked onto a shape at the far end of the corridor. It was tall, and it seemed to sway slightly as though not entirely solid. A vague outline of limbs, an impression of a face draped in shadow. My heart pounded so violently that my vision blurred. I raised the flash FL light, and for a single heartbeat, the beam illuminated what looked like a contorted expression, as if caught between anger and sorrow. Then in a blink, it disappeared. In that flash of encounter, a wave of nausea rolled through me, and I felt a choking sensation in my throat. My breathing came in ragged gasps, and I fought the urge to run. Instead, I let my adrenaline guide me. I stepped forward, the hallway stretching endlessly, my flashlight shaking in my grip. Cold sweat clung to my back. The corridor led to a door I had hardly used, an old storeroom that smelled of mothballs and stale air. The door creaked open to reveal stacked boxes, old furniture covered by sheets, and a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was icy, and every hair on my arm stood on end. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the clutter. For an instant, I thought I saw movement near a covered armchair, the sheet rippling as though touched by an unseen hand. My mouth went dry, and my pulse thundered in my ears. Without thinking, I lunged forward and yanked off the sheet, revealing nothing but the stained fabric of an antique chair, yet the seat cushion appeared unnaturally depressed, as though someone had just been sitting there. My entire body shook with fear. A sharp thud behind me made me whip around, but all I saw was more dusty old boxes. Each breath felt shallow, my lungs aching for air at that point. A primal instinct took over, whether this presence was real or a product of my frayed mind. I realized I could no longer stay in this house. My fight. ORF flight response demanded I flee, but a burning curiosity forced me to linger for just one more look. The tension in the room was palpable, as though some intelligence was measuring my resolve. Then the light bulb flickered again, and in the brief darkness, I heard a low sound that resembled a hiss or a distorted whisper. My heart seized. The light blinked back on, and I found myself alone. I bolted out of the storeroom, stumbling through the corridors, adrenaline pumping so furiously that my hands and feet tingled. I hurried up to my bedroom, grabbed the essentials, a small suitcase of clothes, my laptop, and my phone, and headed straight for the door. Each step felt like it took an eternity as I fought the choking terror that clung to me like a suffocating blanket. Part of me wondered if the shape lurked just behind every corner, waiting to strike another part. Wondered if I was losing my mind, creating phantoms out of stress and isolation. Once outside, the night air felt cold, yet strangely invigorating, like a slap that jolted me from a nightmare. The moonlight cast long, distorted shadows across the yard, and the old trees rustled without any real breeze. My car sat waiting near the gate, and I wasted no time throwing my belongings into the back seat before I drove off. I glanced back at the house. Its windows stared blankly, reflecting the pale glow of the moon. In that moment, I sensed something watching me from just behind the glass on the second floor. A chill pricked my skin, and my blood felt like ice in my veins. My heart hammered mercilessly, and I had to swallow against the dryness in my throat. Then I tore my eyes away and started the engine. The road away from that property seemed to unwind endlessly, as though the house's spell tried to keep me close. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and my breath came in ragged bursts. Even after the structure vanished from view, I couldn't shake the sensation of an invisible gaze trailing me when I finally reached my new lodging. An unremarkable motel in a nearby town, my reflection in the rearview mirror revealed a haunted expression that made me shudder. The feeling that something might still be behind me, right there in the back seat, lingered far longer than I care to admit. I've since moved on, finding a simpler apartment closer to civilization, yet I cannot dispel the heavy sense of unease whenever I recall the hollow corridors and the silent gloom of that old house. Sleep still eludes me some nights, haunted by the certainty that there is something within those brick walls I escaped. But at times a fleeting thought poisons my mind. Perhaps whatever lurked in that place didn't stay behind. Maybe it follows me in the shadows, buying its time, waiting for my defenses to slip. That possibility sends a fresh chill through my veins, reminding me of the night I glimpsed an impossible figure at the edge of my flashlight's beam. I've tried to find logical explanations. I've read about sleep deprivation, learned about how anxiety can feed hallucinations, and considered the echo of my own footsteps as a potential culprit. But late at night, when the lights are off and I'm lying in bed, the memory of that tall, swaying outline returns. My pulse quickens and a clammy sweat covers my forehead. I can almost hear those dragging footsteps in the hall. There are some places I've come to believe where reality frays at the edges and the things that slip through are not easily forgotten. And while I'm relieved to be out of that house, I know it has left a permanent mark on me, a reminder that some presences may not be bound by walls or locked doors. They can linger in the corners of your mind, waiting in the darkness, reminding you that some horrors cannot be neatly packed away or safely ignored.